inside. So he did. It only took 2 tries, with a smile fixed on his face, to make himself climb the short flight of painted wood steps at the back of the wagon. He was not afraid, but any fool would know enough to be nervous. Despite the lack of windows, the interior of the wagon was well lighted, with 4 mirrored lamps burning, and the lamps held good oil, so there was no rancid smell. But then, with the stink from outside, it would have been hard to tell. He needed to find a better spot to park his wagon. A small brick stove with an iron door and an iron top for cooking made the space toasty compared with outside. It was not a large wagon, and every inch of wall that could be spared was covered with cabinets or shelves or pegs for hanging clothing and towels and the like. But the table that could be let down on ropes was snug against the ceiling, and the 3 women inside the wagon were hardly crowded. They could not have been more different, those 3. Mistress Anand was sitting on one of the 2 narrow beds built into the walls, a regal woman with touches of gray in her hair, seemingly intent on her embroidery hoop and not looking at all as if she were a guard. A large golden ring hung on each of her ears, and her marriage knife dangled from a close-fitting silver necklace, the hilt with its red and white stones snug in the cleavage exposed by the narrow plunging neckline of her ebudari dress that had one side of the skirt sewn up to expose yellow petticoats. She wore another knife with a long curved blade tucked behind her belt, but that was just the custom of Ebudar. Satala had refused to take on any disguise, which seemed well enough. No one had reason to be hunting for her, and finding clothes for everyone else had been a big enough problem as it was. Solucia, a pretty woman with skin the color of buttery cream, was cross-legged on the floor between the beds, a dark scarf covering her shaven head, and a sullen expression on her face, though normally she was dignified enough to make Mistress Anand look flighty. Her eyes were as blue as Aginan's and more piercing, and she had made more fuss than Aginan over losing the rest of her hair. She disliked the dark blue ebudari dress she had been given too, claiming the deep neckline was indecent, but it hid her as effectively as a mask. Few men who glimpsed Solucia's impressive bosom would be able to focus long on her face. He might have enjoyed the view for a moment or two himself, but there was Tuan, seated on the wagon's only stool, a leather-bound book open on her lap, and he could barely make himself look at anything else. His wife-to-be. Light. Tuan was tiny, not just short, but almost slim as a boy, and the loose-fitting dress of brown wool, bought from one of the showfolk, made her seem a child wearing her older sister's clothes. Not at all the sort of woman he enjoyed, especially with only a few days' growth of black stubble covering her scalp. If you ignored that, she was pretty, though, in a reserved way, with her heart-shaped face and full lips, her eyes large, dark, liquid pools of serenity. That utter calmness almost unnerved him. Not even an Aes Sedai would be serene in her circumstances. The bloody dice in his head did not help matters. Setala has been keeping me informed, she said in a cool drawl as he pulled the door shut. He had gotten so he could tell a difference in the Shonchan accents. Tuan's made Aginan sound as if she had a mouthful of mush, but they all sounded slurred and slow. She's told me the story you have put about concerning me, Toy. Tuan had persisted in calling him that, back in the Terracin Palace. He had not cared then. Well, not much. My name is Matt, he began.
I'll be right back.
He never saw where the pottery cup in her hand came from, but he managed to drop to the floor in time for it to shatter against the door instead of his head.
I'll be right back. I gotta go get my smoke.
Servant, Toy? If Tuan's tone had been cool before, now it was deep winter ice. She barely raised her voice, but it was hard as ice, too. Her expression would have made a hanging judge look giddy. A thieving servant? The book slid from her lap as she stood and bent to snatch up the lidded white chamber pot. A faithless servant? We will need that, Solucia said deferentially, slipping the bulbous pot out of Tuan's hands. Setting it carefully to one side, she crouched at Tuan's feet, almost as if ready to hurl herself at Matt, laughable as that was, though nothing much seemed laughable right then. Mistress Anand reached up to one of the railed shelves above her head and handed Tuan another cup. We have plenty of these, she murmured. Matt shot her an indignant look, but her hazel eyes twinkled with amusement. Amusement? She was supposed to be guarding those 2. A fist thumped on the door. Do you need help in there? Arnon called uncertainly. Matt wondered which of them he was asking. We have everything well in hand, Satala called back, calmly pushing her needle through the fabric stretched on her hoop. He would have thought that needlework was the most important thing. Go on about your work. Don't dawdle. The woman was not Abu Dari, but she certainly had soaked up Abu Dari ways. After a moment, boots thumped back down
How
the
you
steps
doing,
outside.
Gardner?
It seemed Harnan had been too long in Abu Dar as well. Tuan turned the new cup in her hands as though examining the flowers painted on it, and her lips worked in a smile so small it almost might have been Matt's imagination. She was more than pretty when she smiled, but it was one of those smiles that said she knew things he did not. He was going to break out in hives if she kept doing that. I will not be known as a servant, Toy. My name is Matt, not that other thing, he said, climbing to his feet and cautiously testing his hip. To his surprise, it ached no worse after smacking the floorboards. Tuan arched an eyebrow and hefted the cup in one hand. I could hardly tell the showfolk I'd kidnapped the daughter of the 9 moons, he said in exasperation. The High Lady Tuan, peasant, Solucia said crisply. She is under the veil. Veil? Tuan had worn a veil in the palace, but not since. The tiny woman gestured graciously, the queen granting license. It is of no import, Solucia. He is ignorant yet. We must educate him. But you will change this story, Toy. I will not be a servant. It's too late to change anything, Matt said, keeping an eye on that cup. Her hands looked frail, with those
I
long
always had
fingernails
trouble
cut short.
sleeping.
But he remembered how quick they were.
That's why I tend to
Nobody's
do
asking you
this
to
and
be a
smoke a little
servant.
bit.
Luca and his wife knew the truth, but there had to be some reason to give everyone else why Tuan and Solucia were kept confined to this wagon and guarded. The perfect solution had been a pair of serving girls about to be dismissed for theft, who had intended to betray their mistress's flight with her lover. It seemed perfect to Matt, anyway. To the showfolk, it only added to the romance. He had thought Aginin was going to swallow her tongue while he was explaining to Luca. Maybe she had known how Tuan would take it. Lydie almost wished the dice would stop. How could a man think with that in his head? I couldn't leave you behind to raise an alarm, he went on patiently. That was true, as far as it went. I know Mistress Annan has explained it to you. He thought about saying he had been babbling from nerves when he said she was his wife. She must think him a complete ruby. But it seemed best not to bring it up again. If she was willing to let the matter lie, all the better. I know she's already told you this, but I promise no one's going to hurt you. We're not after ransom, just getting away with our heads still attached. As soon as I can figure out how to send you home safe and sound, I will. I promise. I'll make you as comfortable as I can until then. You'll just have to put up with the other. Tuan's big dark eyes crackled, heat lightning in a night sky. But she said, It seems I will see what your promises are worth, Toy. At her feet, Solucia hissed like a doused cat, her head half turning as if to object, but Tuan's left hand wiggled, and the blue-eyed woman blushed and went silent. The blood used something like maiden hand talk with their upper servants. Matt wished he understood the signals. Answer me a question, Tuan, he said. He thought he heard Satala murmur, fool. Solucia's jaw nodded, and a dangerous look kindled in Tuan's eyes, but if she was going to call him Toy, he would be burned if he gave her any titles. How old are you?
He's not doing too bad.
He had heard that she was only a few years younger than he, but looking at her in that sack of a dress, it seemed impossible. To his surprise, that dangerous spark burst into flame. Not just heat lightning this time. He should have been fried on the spot. Tuan threw back her shoulders and drew herself to her full height. Such as that was, he doubted she could reach 5 feet with her heels flat, however she stretched. My 14th true name day will come in 5 months, she said in a voice that was far from cold. In fact, it could have heated the wagon better than the stove. He felt a moment of hope, but she was not finished. No, you keep your birth names here, don't you? That will be my 20th naming day. Are you satisfied, Toy? Did you fear you had stolen a child? She almost hissed the last word. Matt waved his hands in front of him, frantically dismissing the suggestion. A woman started hissing at him like a kettle. A man with any brains found a way to cool her down fast. She was gripping the cup so tightly that tendons stood out on the back of her hand, and he did not want to try his hip with another fall to the floor. Come to think on it, he was not sure how hard she had tried to hit him the first time. Her hands were very fast. I just wanted to know, that's all, he said quickly. I was curious, making conversation. I'm only a little older myself. 20. So much for hoping she was too young to marry for another 3 or 4 years. Anything that came between him and his wedding day would have been welcome. Tuan studied him suspiciously with her head tilted, then tossed the cup onto the bed beside Mistress Anand, and seated herself on the stool again, taking as much care about arranging her voluminous woolen skirts as if they had belonged to a silk gown. But she continued to examine him through her long eyelashes. "Where is your ring?" she demanded. Unconsciously, he thumbed the finger on his left hand where the long ring usually lay. "I don't wear it all the time. Not when everybody in the Terracin Palace knew he wore it. The thing would have stood out with his rough layabout's garb in any case. It was not even his signet, anyway, just a carver's tri-piece. Strange how his hand felt noticeably lighter without it. Too light. Strange that she remarked on it, too. But then, why not? Right, those dice had him shying at shadows and jumping at size. Or maybe it was just her. A discomforting thought. He moved to sit on the unoccupied bed, but Solucia swung herself up onto it so
Hell
quickly,
yeah,
any
Gardner.
of the
You have a good
acrobats might
night
have been
too,
jealous,
brother.
and stretched out with her
I
head
definitely
propped on her
smoked one
hand.
for you.
That pushed her scarf
And do
askew
the
for a
dab.
moment, but she hurriedly straightened it, all the while staring at him, proud and cold as a queen. He looked at the other bed, and Mistress Anand set down her embroidery long enough to ostentatiously smooth her skirts, making it clear she did not intend to share an inch. Burn her, she was behaving as though she were guarding Tuan from him. Women always seemed to club together, so a man never had a fair chance. Well, he had managed to keep Aginan from taking charge so far, and he was not about to be bullied by Sitala Anand, or a bosomy lady's maid, or the high and mighty High Lady Daughter of the 9 Bloody Moons. Only, he could hardly go shoving one of them out of the way to find a place to sit. Leaning against a drawered cabinet at the foot of the bed Mistress Anand was seated on, he tried to think of what to say. He never had trouble thinking of what to say to women, but his brain seemed deafened by the sound of those dice. All 3 women gave him disapproving looks. He could all but hear one of them telling him not to slouch. So he smiled. Most women thought his best smile very winning. Tuan let out a long breath that did not sound won over in the slightest. "Do you remember Hawkwing's face, Toy?" Mistress Anand blinked in surprise, and Solucia sat up on the bed frowning. At him. Why would she frown at him? Tuan just continued to look at him, hands folded in her lap, as cool and collected as a wisdom at Sunday. Matt's smile felt frozen. Right, what did she know? How could she know anything? He lay beneath the burning sun, holding his side with both hands, trying to keep the last of life from leaking out and wondering whether there was any reason to hold on. Aldashar was finished after this day's work. A shadow blotted the sun for an instant, and then a tall man in armor crouched beside him, helmet tucked under his arm, dark, deep-set eyes framing a hooked nose. "You fought well against me today, Culain, and many days past," that memorable voice said. "Will you live with me in peace?" With his last breath, he laughed in Arthur Hawkwing's face. He hated to remember dying. A dozen other encounters skittered through his mind, too. Ancient memories that were his now. Arthur Paindrag had been a difficult man to get along with even before the wars started. Drawing a deep breath, he took care choosing his words. This was no time to go spouting the old tongue. "Of course I don't," he lied. A man who could not lie convincingly got short shrift from women. Light. Hawkwing died 1,000 years ago. What kind of question is that? Her mouth opened slowly, and for a moment he was sure she meant to answer question with question. "A foolish one, Toy," she replied finally instead. "I can't say why it popped into my head." The stiffness in Matt's shoulders relaxed a little. Of course, he was Taviran. People did things and said things around him they never would elsewhere. Nonsense qualified. Still, a thing like that could become uncomfortable when it hit too close to home. "My name is Matt Coffin." He might as well not have spoken. "I cannot say what I will do after returning to Abu Dar, Toy. I have not decided. I may have you made Dakovale. You are not pretty enough for a cupbearer, but it might please me to have you for one. Still, you have represented certain promises to me, so it pleases me now to promise as well. So long as you keep your promises, I will neither escape nor betray you in any way, nor will I cause dissension among your followers. I believe that covers everything necessary." This time, Mistress Anand gaped at her, and Solutia made a sound in her throat, but Tuan appeared not to notice either woman. She just looked at him expectantly, waiting on a response. He made a sound in his throat, too. Not a whimper, just a sound. Tuan's face was as smooth as a stern mask of dark glass. Her calm was madness, but this made gibbering look sane. She would have to be insane to think he would believe that of her, except he thought she did mean it. That, or she was a better liar than he ever hoped to be. Again, he had that queasy sense that she knew more than he did. Ridiculous, of course, but there it was. He swallowed a lump in his throat. A hard lump. "Well, that does all right for you," he said, trying to buy time. "But what about Solutia?" Time for what? He could not think with those dice pounding in his skull. "Solutia follows my wishes, Toy," she said impatiently. The blue-eyed woman herself straightened and stared at him as though indignant that he had doubted that. For a lady's maid, she could look fierce when she tried. Matt did not know what to say or do. Without thinking, he spat on his palm and offered his hand as if sealing a bargain on a horse. "Your customs are earthy," Tuan said in a dry voice, but she spat on her own palm and clasped his hand. "Thus is our treaty written. Thus is our agreement made. What does that writing on your spear mean, Toy?" He did whimper this time, and not because she had read the old-tongue inscription on his Ashandarai. A bloody stone would have whimpered. The dice had stopped as soon as he touched her hand. Right, what had happened? Knuckles rapped on the door, and he was so on edge that he moved without thought, spinning, a knife coming into either hand ready to throw at whatever came in. "Stay behind me," he snapped. The door opened, and Tom stuck his head in. The hood of his cloak was up, and Matt realized it was raining outside. Between Tuan and the dice, he had missed the sound of rain hitting the wagon's roof. "I trust I'm not interrupting anything," Tom said, knuckling his long white mustaches. Matt's face heated. Satala had frozen with her embroidery needle trailing blue thread down to her work, and her eyebrows seemed to be trying to climb over the top of her head. Tensed on the edge of the other bed, Solutia watched him flip the knives back up his sleeves with considerable interest. He would not have thought she was the sort to like dangerous men. That kind of woman was worth avoiding. They tended to find ways to make a man need to be dangerous. He did not glance back at Tuan. She was probably staring at him as if he had been capering like Luca. Just because he did not want to get married did not mean he wanted his future wife to think him a fool. "What did you find out, Tom?" he asked brusquely. Something had happened, or the dice would not have stopped. A thought came that made his hair want to stand on end. This was the second time they had stopped in Tuan's presence. The third, counting the gate leading out of Abu Dar. 3 bloody times, and all tied to her. Limping slightly, the white-haired man came the rest of the way in, pushing back his hood, and pulled the door shut behind him. His limp came from an old injury, not trouble in the city. Tall and lean and leathery, with sharp blue eyes and snowy mustaches that hung below his chin, it seemed he would draw attention wherever he went. But he had practice at hiding in plain sight, and his dark bronze coat and brown wool cloak were suitable for a man with a little coin to spend, but not too much. "The streets are full of rumors about her," he said, nodding toward Tuan, "but nothing about her disappearing. I bought drinks for a few Shonchan officers, and they seem to believe she's snug in the Terracin Palace, or off on an inspection trip. I didn't sense any dissembling, Matt. They didn't know." "Did you expect public announcements, Toy?" Tuan said incredulously. "As it is, Serath may be considering taking her own life for the shame. Do you expect her to spread such an ill omen for the return of Bat for everyone to see on top of that?" So Aginan had been right. It still seemed impossible. And it did not seem at all important compared to the dice stopping. What had happened? He had shaken hands with Tuan, that was all. Shaken hands and made a bargain. He meant to keep his side, but what had the dice told him? That she would keep hers, or that she would not? For all he knew, Shonchan noblewomen were in the habit of marrying. What was it she had said she was going to make him? Cupbearer? Maybe they married cupbearers all the time. There's more, Matt, Tom said, eyeing Tuan thoughtfully and with a hint of surprise. It came to Matt that she did not appear overly concerned that Suroth might kill herself. Maybe she was as tough as Dolman thought. What were the bloody dice trying to tell him? That was what was important. Then Tom went on, and Matt forgot about how tough Tuan might be, and even the dice. Thailand's dead. They're keeping it quiet for fear of disturbances, but one of the palace guards, a young lieutenant who couldn't hold his brandy, told me they're planning her funeral feast and Beslin's coronation for the same day. How? Matt demanded. She was older than he, but not that much older. Beslin's coronation. Light. How would Beslin cope with that, when he hated the Shonchan? It had been his plan to fire those supplies in the Bay Road. He would have tried an uprising if Matt had not convinced him it would only result in a slaughter, and not of Shonchan. Tom hesitated, stroking his mustaches with a thumb. Finally, he sighed. She was bound in her bedchamber the morning after we left, Matt. Still bound, hand and foot. Her head had been torn off. Matt did not realize his knees had given way until he found himself sitting on the floor with his head buzzing. He could hear her voice. You'll get your head cut off if you're not careful, Piglet. And I wouldn't like that. Sakala leaned forward on the narrow bed to press a hand against his cheek in commiseration. The Windfinders, he said hollowly. He did not have to say more. According to what that lieutenant said, the Shonchan have settled on Aes Sedai for the blame, because Thailand had sworn the Shonchan oaths. That's what they'll announce at her funeral feast. Thailand dies the same night the Windfinders escape, and the Shonchan believe Aes Sedai killed her. He could not imagine Thailand dead. I'm going to have you for supper, duckling. That doesn't make sense, Tom. Tom hesitated, frowning as he considered. It could be political in part, but I think that's what they really believe, Matt. That lieutenant said they're sure the Windfinders were running too hard to stop or go out of their way. And the quickest path out of the palace from the demonic kennels goes nowhere near Thailand's apartments. Matt grunted. He was sure it was not so. And if it were, there was nothing in the world he could do about it. The Marath Damani had reason to murder Thailand, Selucia said suddenly. They must fear her example for others. What reason had the Damani you speak of? None. The hand of justice requires motive and proof, even for Damani and Dakovale. She sounded as though she were reading the words off a page, and she was looking at Tuan from the corner of her eye. Matt looked over his shoulder, but if the tiny woman had been using her hands to tell Selucia what to say, they were resting in her lap, now. She was watching him, a neutral expression on her face. Did you care for Thailand so deeply? She said in a cautious voice. Yes. No. Burn me, I liked her. Turning away, he scrubbed fingers through his hair, pushing the cap off. He had never been so glad to get away from a woman in his life. But this... And I left her tied up and gagged so she couldn't even call for help. Easy prey for the golem, he said bitterly. It was looking for me. Don't shake your head, Tom. You know it as well as I do. What is, golem? Tuan asked. Shadow spawn, my lady, Tom said. He frowned worriedly. He did not take easily to worry, but anybody except a fool would worry about a golem. It looks like a man, but it can slip through a mouse hole or under a door, and it's strong enough to... He harumphed through his mustaches. Well, enough of that. Matt, she could have had 100 guards around her, and it wouldn't have stopped that thing. She would not have needed 100 guards if she had not taken up with Matt Coffin. That golem, Tuan murmured wryly. Suddenly, she rapped Matt hard on the top of his head with her knuckles. Clapping a hand to his scalp, he stared over his shoulder incredulously. I'm very happy that you show loyalty to Thailand, Toy, she said in a severe voice. But I won't have superstition in you. I will not have it. It does Thailand no honor. Vernon, Thailand's death seemed to concern her as little as whether or not Suroth committed suicide. What kind of a woman was he going to marry? When a fist pounded on the door this time, he did not even bother to stand. He felt numb at the core and scraped raw on the surface. Blarick pushed into the wagon without asking, his dark brown cloak dripping rain. It was an old cloak, worn thin in spots, but he appeared not to care where the rain leaked through. The warder ignored everyone but Matt. Or almost everyone. The man actually took a moment to consider Selucia's bosom. "Jolene wants you, Coffin," he said, still studying her. Right. This was all Matt needed to make it a fine day. "Who is Jolene?" Tuan demanded. Matt ignored her. "Tell Jolene I'll see her once we're on the road, Blarick." The last thing he wanted was to be forced to listen to more of the Aes Sedai's grievances now. "She wants you now, Coffin." With a sigh, Matt got to his feet and gathered his cap from the floor. Blarick looked as if he might try to drag him otherwise. In his own current mood, he thought he might put a knife in the man if he tried, and get his neck broken for his pains. A warder would not take a knife in the ribs lightly. He was fairly sure he had already died the one time he was allowed, and not in an old memory. Sure enough, not to take risks he could sidestep. "Who is Jolene, Toy?" If he had not known better, he would have said Tuan sounded jealous. "A bloody Aes Sedai," he grumbled, tugging the cap on, and got one small pleasure for the day. Tuan's jaw dropped in shock. He shut the door behind him on the way out before she could find a word to say. A very small pleasure. One butterfly on a midden heap. Thailand dead, and the Windfinders might take the blame yet, whatever Tom said. And that was aside from Tuan and the bloody dice. A very tiny butterfly and a very large midden. The sky was full of dark clouds now, and the downpour steady. A soaking rain, they would have called it back home. It began to slick his hair, cap or no, and seep through his coat as soon as he stepped outside. Blarick hardly seemed to notice, barely gathering his cloak. There was nothing for it but for Matt to hunch his shoulders and splash through the widening puddles on the dirt streets. By the time he could reach his wagon for a cloak, he would be drenched to the skin anyway. Besides, the weather fit his spirits. To his surprise, rain or no rain, an incredible amount of work had been done in the short time he was inside. The canvas wall was gone as far as he could see in either direction, and half the storage wagons that had been around Tuan's wagon were missing too. So were most of the animals that had been picketed on the horse lines. A large iron-barred cage containing a black-maned lion trundled past toward the road behind a plotting team, the horses as unconcerned about the apparently sleeping line behind them as they were with the shower. Performers were already taking to the road too, though how they determined the order of leaving was a mystery. Most of the tents seemed to have vanished. In one place, 3 of the brightly colored wagons together might be missing. Another place, every second wagon. While elsewhere, the wagons standing and waiting still seemed a solid mass. The only thing that said the show folk were not scattering was Luca himself, a bright red cloak gathered around him against the wet as he paraded along the street, stopping now and then to clap a man on the shoulder or murmur something to a woman that made her laugh. If the show had been breaking apart, Luca would have been out chasing down those who tried to leave. He held the show together as much by persuasion as anything else, and he never let anyone leave without talking himself hoarse, trying to argue them out of it. Matt knew he should feel good about seeing Luca still there, though it had never occurred to him that the man would run out on the gold. But right at that moment, he doubted that anything could make him feel anything but numb and angry. The wagon that Blarick took him to was almost as large as Luca's, but it had been whitewashed rather than painted. The white had long since run and streaked and faded, and the rain was washing it a little more toward gray, where the wood was not already bare. The wagon belonged to a company of fools, 4 morose men who painted their faces for the show's patrons, dousing each other with water and hitting each other with inflated pig bladders, and otherwise spent their time and money imbibing as much wine as they could buy. With what Matt had paid for rent, they might be drunk for months, and it had cost more than that to make anyone take them in. 4 shaggy, nondescript horses were already hitched to the wagon, and Fen Mizar, Jolene's other warder, was up on the driver's seat, swathed in an old gray cloak, and reins in hand. His tilted eyes watched Matt the way a wolf might watch an impudent cur. The warders had been unhappy with Matt's plan from the start. Sure, they could have gotten the sisters away safely once they were outside the city walls. Perhaps they could have. But the Shorn-Chen hunted vigorously for women who could channel. The show itself apparently had been searched 4 times in the days after Ebradar fell, and all it would have taken was one slip to land all of them in the stew pot. From what Aginin and Dolman said, the Seekers could make a boulder tell everything it had ever seen. Luckily, not all the sisters were as sure as Jolene's warders. Aes Sedai tended to dither when they could not agree on what to do. When Matt reached the steps at the back of the wagon, Blarick stopped him with a hand to his chest. The warder's face might have been carved, no more concerned than a piece of wood with the rain running down his cheeks. Ben and I are grateful to you for getting her out of the city, Cawthon. But this can't continue. The sisters are crowded, sharing with those other women, and they don't get on. There's going to be trouble if we can't find another wagon. Is that what this is about? Matt said crossly, tugging his collar tighter. Not that it did much good. He was already wet through on the back, and not much better in front. If Jolene had pulled him here to whine about the accommodations again... She'll tell you what it's about, Cawthon. Just remember what I said. Grumbling under his breath, Matt climbed the dirt-streaked steps and went in, not quite slamming the door behind him. The wagon was laid out much like the one Tuon was in, though with 4 beds, 2 of them folded flat against the walls above the other 2. He had no idea how the 6 women arranged sleeping, but he suspected it was not done peacefully. The air in the wagon all but crackled like grease on a griddle. 3 women sat on each of the lower beds, each variously watching or ignoring the women seated on the other bed. Jolene, who had never been held as Damani, behaved as though the 3 Suldam did not exist. Reading a small wood-bound book, she was an Aes Sedai to the ancient arrogance on a stick, despite her well-worn blue dress, lately owned by a woman who taught the lions to do tricks. The other 2 sisters knew firsthand what it was to be Damani, though. Edicina watched the 3 Suldam warily, one hand resting near her belt knife, while Teslin's eyes shifted constantly, looking at anything except the Suldam, and her hands kneaded her dark woolen skirts. He did not know how Aginin had coerced the 3 Suldam into helping Damani escape, but even though they were being sought by the authorities as surely as Aginin, they had not changed their attitudes toward women who could channel. Bethamin, tall and as dark as Tuon in an Ebudari dress, with a very deep neckline and skirts sewn up above her knee on one side to show faded red petticoats, seemed a mother waiting for inevitable misbehavior by children, while yellow-haired Sita, in high-necked gray wool that covered her completely, appeared to be studying dangerous dogs that would need to be caged sooner or later. Brenna, she of the talk about cutting off hands and feet, pretended to be reading too, but every so often her deceptively mild brown eyes rose from the slim volume to study the Aes Sedai, and when they did, she smiled in an unpleasant way. Matt felt like cursing before one of them opened her mouth. A wise man kept clear when women were at odds, especially if there were Aes Sedai among them, but this was how it always was when it came to this wagon. This better be important, Jolene. Unbuttoning his coat, he tried to shake some of the water off. He thought he would do better wringing the garment out. I just learned that the Golem killed Tylen the night we left, and I'm in no mood for complaints. Jolene marked her place carefully with an embroidered marker and folded her hands in the book before speaking. Aes Sedai never hurried. They just expected everyone else to. Without him, she likely would have been wearing an idam by now herself, but he had never found Aes Sedai particularly noted for gratitude either. She ignored what he had said about Tylen. Blarick tells me the show has already begun moving, she said coolly. But you must stop it. Luca will only listen to you. Her mouth tightened slightly on the words. Aes Sedai also were unused to not being listened to, and Greens were not the best at hiding their displeasure. We must abandon the idea of Lugard for the time being. We must take the ferry across the harbor and go to Ilion. That was about as bad a suggestion as he had heard out of her, though she did not mean it for a suggestion, of course. She was worse than Aginin that way. With half the show already on the road, or near enough, it would take all day just to get everyone down to the ferry landing, and it would mean going into the city besides. Heading for Lugard took the show away from the Shanshan as quickly as possible, while they had soldiers camped all the way to the Ilion border and maybe beyond. Aginin was reluctant to tell what she knew, but Tom had his ways of learning these things. Matt did not bother to crack his teeth, though. He did not need to. No, Teslin said in a tight voice, her Ilioner accent strong. Leaning past Edicina, she looked as though she chewed rocks 3 meals a day, hard-faced and set-jawed, but there was a nervousness in her eyes, put there by her weeks as a Damani. No, Jolene. I have told you. We do not dare risk it. We do not dare. Light, Jolene spat, slamming her book to the floor. Take hold of yourself, Teslin. Just because you were held prisoner for a little time is no reason to go to pieces. Go to pieces. Go to pieces. Let them put that collar on you, and then speak of going to pieces. Teslin's hand went to her throat, as though she felt the Idam's collar still. Help me convince her, Edicina. She will have us collared again if we do let her. Edicina drew back on herself against the wall behind the bed. A slim, handsome woman, with black hair spilling to her waist. She always went silent when the red and the green argued, as they did often. But Jolene did not spare her so much as a glance. You ask a rebel for help, Teslin? We should have left her for the Shanchan. Listen to me. You can feel it as well as I. Would you really accept a greater danger to avoid a lesser? Lesser, Teslin snarled. You do know nothing of... Rena held her book out at arm's length and let it drop to the floor with a bang. If my lord will excuse us a little while, we still have our Idam, and we can teach these girls to behave again in short order. Her accent had a musical quality, but the smile on her lips never touched her brown eyes. It never works to let them go slack this way. Sita nodded grimly and stood as if to fetch out the leashes. I think we're done with Idam, Bethamin said, ignoring the shocked looks from the other two Sul'dam. But there are other ways to settle these girls down. May I suggest my lord return in an hour? They'll tell you what you want to know without any squabbling once they can't sit down. She sounded as though she meant exactly what she said. Jolene was staring at the three Sul'dam in outraged disbelief, but Edicina was sitting up straight, gripping her belt knife with a determined expression, while Teslin was now the one shrinking back against the wall, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. That won't be necessary, Matt said after a moment. Only a moment. However satisfying it might be to have Jolene settled down, Edicina might draw that knife. And that would set the cat among the chickens no matter how it turned out. What greater danger are you talking about, Jolene? Jolene? What danger is greater than the Shanchan right now? The green decided her stare was making no impression on Bethamin, and turned it on Matt instead. Had she been other than Aes Sedai, he would have said she looked sulky. Jolene disliked explaining. If you must know, someone is channeling. Teslin and Edicina nodded, the red sister reluctantly, the yellow emphatically. In the camp, he said in alarm. His right hand rose on its own to press against the silver fox head under his shirt, but the medallion had not turned cold. Far away, Jolene replied, still unwilling. To the north. Much farther than any of us should be able to sense channeling, Edicina put in, a touch of fear in her voice. The amount of Saidar being wielded must be immense. Inconceivable. She fell silent at a sharp glance from Jolene, who turned back to study Matt as though deciding how much she had to tell him. At that distance, she went on, we wouldn't be able to feel every sister in the tower channeling. It has to be the Forsaken, and whatever they're doing, we do not want to be any closer than we can avoid. Matt was still for a moment. Then finally he said, if it's far, then we stick with the plan. Jolene went on arguing, but he did not bother to listen. Whenever he thought of Rand or Perrin, colors swirled in his head. A part of being Ta'Veren, he supposed. This time he had not thought of either of his friends, but the colors had suddenly been there, a fan of 1,000 rainbows. This time they had almost formed an image, a vague impression that might have been a man and a woman, seated on the ground facing one another. It was gone in an instant, but he knew as surely as he knew his name. Not the Forsaken. Rand. And he could not help wondering what Rand had been doing when the dice stopped. Chapter 4. The Tale of a Doll. Beric Kharid sat staring at his writing table without seeing the papers and maps spread out in front of him. Both of his oil lamps were lit and sitting on the table, but he no longer had need of them. The sun must be rimming the horizon, yet since waking from a fitful sleep and saying his devotions to the Empress, might she live forever, he had only donned his robe in the dark imperial green that some insisted on calling black, and sat here without moving since. He had not even shaved. The rain had stopped, and he considered telling his servant Aljambura to swing a window open for a little fresh air in his room with the wandering woman. Clean air might clear his head. But over the last 5 days, there had been lulls in the rain that ended with sudden drenching downpours, and his bed was located between the windows. He had needed to have his mattress and bedding hung in the kitchen to dry once already. A tiny squeal and a pleased grunt from Ajimbura made him look up to find the wiry little man displaying a limp rat, half the size of a cat, on the end of his long knife. It was not the first Ajimbura had killed in this room recently, something Farid believed would not have happened if Satala Anand still owned the inn, though the number of rats in Abu Dar seemed to be increasing well in advance of spring. Ajimbura looked a little like a wizened rat himself, his grin both satisfied and feral. After more than 300 years under the empire, the King Sada Hill tribes were only half civilized, and less than half tamed. The man wore his white-streaked dark red hair and a thick braid that hung to his waist to make a good trophy if he ever found his way back to those near mountains and fell in one of the endless feuds between families or tribes. And he insisted on drinking from a silver-mounted cup that anyone who looked closely could see was the top of someone's skull. "If you are going to eat that," Farid said, as though there were any question, "you will clean it in the stable yard, out of anyone's sight." Ajimbura would eat anything except for lizards, which were forbidden to his tribe for some reason he would never make clear. "But of course, High One," the man replied, with the hunch of his shoulders that passed for a bow among his people. "I know well the ways of the town people, and I would not embarrass the High One." After close to 20 years in Farid's service, without a reminder, he still would have skinned out the rat and roasted it over the flames in the small brick fireplace. Scraping the carcass off the blade into a small canvas sack, Ajimbura tucked that into a corner for later, and carefully wiped his knife clean before sheathing it, and settling on his heels to await Farid's needs. He would wait like that all day, if necessary, as patiently as Dr. Vale. Farid had never puzzled out exactly why Ajimbura had left his hill fort home to follow one of the Death Watch Guard. It was a much more circumscribed life than the man had known before, and besides, Farid had nearly killed him 3 times before he made that choice. Dismissing thoughts of his servant, he returned to the display on his writing table, though he had no intention of taking up his pen for the moment. He had been raised to Banner General for achieving some small success in the battles with the Ashaman, days when few had achieved any. And now, because he commanded against men who could channel, some thought he must have wisdom to share about fighting Marth Damani. No one had had to do that in centuries, and since the so-called Aes Sedai revealed their unknown weapon only a few leagues from where he sat, a great deal of thinking had gone into how to cripple their power. That was not the only request littering the tabletop. Aside from the usual run of requisitions and reports that needed his signature, his comments on the forces arrayed against them in Ilion had been solicited by 4 lords and 3 ladies, and on the special Aiel problem by 6 ladies and 5 lords. But those questions would be decided elsewhere, very likely already had been decided. His observations would only be used in the infighting over who controlled what in the return. In any event, war had always been a second calling for the Death Watch Guard. Oh, the guards were always there whenever a major battle was fought, the sword hand of the Empress, might she live forever, to strike at her enemies whether or not she herself was present, always to lead the way where the fight was hottest. But their first calling was to protect the lives and persons of the imperial family, with their own lives, when necessary, and willingly given. And 9 nights passed. The High Lady Tuon had vanished as if swallowed by the storm. He did not think of her as the daughter of the 9 moons, could not until he knew she was no longer under the veil. He had not considered taking his own life either, though the shame cut him keenly. It was for the blood to resort to the easy way to escape disgrace. The Death Watch Guard fought to the last. Mosenji commanded her personal bodyguard, but as the highest-ranking member of the guard this side of the Arth Ocean, it was Farid's duty to return her safely. Every cranny in the city was being searched on one excuse or another, every vessel larger than a rowboat, but most often by men ignorant of what they were searching for, unaware that the fate of the return might rest on their diligence. The duty was his. Of course, the imperial family was given to even more complicated intrigues than the rest of the blood, and the High Lady Tuon frequently played a very deep game indeed, with a sharp and deadly skill. Only a few were aware that she had vanished twice before, and had been reported dead at the very arrangement of her funeral rites, all by her own contriving. Whatever the reasons for her disappearance, though, he had to find and protect her. So far, he had no clue how. Swallowed by the storm, or perhaps by the Lady of the Shadows. There had been countless attempts to kidnap or assassinate her, beginning on the day of her birth. If he found her dead, he must find who killed her, who had given the ultimate commands, and avenge her whatever the cost. That was his duty, too. A slender man slipped into the room from the hallway without knocking. He might have been one of the inn's stablemen from his rough coat, but no local had his pale hair or the blue eyes that slid across the room as though memorizing everything in it. His hand slipped under his coat, and Khalid rehearsed 2 ways of killing him barehanded in the brief moment before he produced a small, gold-bordered ivory plaque worked with the raven in the tower. Seekers for the truth did not have to knock. Killing them was frowned upon. "Leave us," the seeker told Ajimbora, tucking away the plaque once he was sure Khalid had recognized it. The little man remained crouched on his heels, motionless, and the seeker's eyebrows rose in surprise. Even in the Cane-Sata Hills, everyone knew a seeker's word was law. Well, perhaps not in some of the more remote hill forts, not if they believed no one knew the seeker was there. But Ajimbora knew better than this. "Wait outside," Khalid commanded sharply, and Ajimbora rose with alacrity, murmuring, "I hear and obey, High One." He studied the seeker openly, though, as if to make sure the seeker knew he had marked his face before leaving the room. He was going to get himself beheaded one day. "A precious thing, loyalty," the pale-haired man said, eyeing the tabletop after Ajimbora pulled the door shut behind himself. "You are involved in Lord Ulan's plans, Banner General Khalid? I would not have expected the Death Watch Guard to be part of that." Khalid moved 2 bronze map weights, shaped like lions, and let the map of Tarvalin roll up on itself. The other had not been unrolled yet. "You must ask Lord Ulan, Seeker. Loyalty to the Crystal Throne is precious above the breath of life, followed closely by knowing when to keep silent. The more who speak of a thing, the more will learn of it who should not." No one short of the Imperial family rebuked a seeker, or whatever hand guided him, but the fellow appeared unaffected. Then again, he seated himself in the room's cushioned armchair and made a tent of his fingers, peering over them at Khalid, who had the choice of moving his own chair or leaving the man almost at his back. Most people would have been very nervous about having a seeker behind them. Most would have been nervous having a seeker in the same room. Khalid hid his smile and did not move. He only had to turn his head a fraction, and he was trained at seeing clearly what lay in the corners of sight. "You must be proud of your sons," the seeker said. "2 following you into the Death Watch Guard, the 3rd listed among the honored dead. Your wife would have been very proud. What is your name, Seeker?" The answering silence was deafening. More people rebuked seekers than inquired after their names. "Moore," the reply came finally. "Almarat Moore." So, Moore. He had an ancestor who had come with Luther Payendrag then, and was rightly proud. Without access to the breeding books, which no Dr. Vale was allowed, Khalid had no way of knowing whether any of the tales about his own ancestry were true. He also might have an ancestor who had once followed the Great Hawkwind, but it did not matter. Men who tried to stand on their forebears' shoulders, other than their own feet, often found themselves shorter by a head, especially Dr. Vale. "Call me Furik. We are both the property of the Crystal Throne. What do you want of me, Almarat? Not to discuss my family, I think." If his sons were in trouble, the fellow would never have mentioned them so soon. Kalia was beyond any misery. From the corner of his eye, Khalid could see the struggle on the seeker's face, though he hid it almost well enough. The man had lost control of the interview, as he might have expected, flashing his plaque as though a Death Watch guard were not ready to thrust a dagger into his own heart in command. "Listen to a story," Moore said slowly, "and tell me what you think." His gaze was fastened to Khalid as if by tacks, studying, weighing, evaluating, as though Khalid were on the block at sale. "This came to us in the last few days." By us, he meant the Seekers. "It began among the local people, as near as we can tell, though we have not yet found the original source. Supposedly, a girl with a Shandar accent has been extorting gold and jewelry from merchants here in Debudar. The title Daughter of the Nine Moons was mentioned. He grimaced with disgust, and for a moment his fingertips turned white. They were pressing against each other so hard. None of the locals seem to understand what the title means, but the description of the girl is remarkably precise, remarkably accurate. And no one can recall hearing this rumor before the night after Tylen's murder was discovered, he finished, choosing the last unpleasant event to fix the time. A Shandar accent, Farid said in a flat voice, and Moore nodded. This rumor has passed to our own people. That was not a question, but Moore nodded again. A Shandar accent and an accurate description, two things no local could invent. Someone was playing a very dangerous game, dangerous for themselves and for the Empire. How does the Terrason Palace take recent events? There would be listeners among the servants, likely among even the Abudari servants by now, and what the listeners heard soon passed to the seekers. Moore understood the question, of course. There was no need to mention what should not be mentioned. He replied in an indifferent tone. The High Lady Tuan's entourage carries on as though nothing has happened, except that Anath, her truth speaker, has taken to seclusion. But I am told that it is not unusual for her. Surath herself is even more distraught in private than in public. She sleeps poorly, snaps at her favorites, and has her property beaten over trifles. She ordered the death of one seeker each day until matters are rectified, and only rescinded the order this morning when she realized she might run out of seekers before she ran out of days. His shoulders moved in a small shrug, perhaps to indicate this was all in the day for seekers, perhaps in relief at a near escape. It's understandable. If she is called to account, she will pray for the death of 10,000 tears. The other blood who know what has happened are trying to grow eyes in the backs of their heads. A few have even quietly made funeral arrangements to cover any eventuality. Farid wanted a clearer look at the man's face. He was inured to insult. That was part of the training. This. Pushing back his chair, he stood and sat at the edge of the writing table. Moore stared at him unblinking, tensed to defend himself against an attack, and Farid drew a deep breath to still his anger. Why did you come to me if you believe the Death Watch guards are implicated in this? The effort of keeping his voice level almost strangled him. Since the first Death Watch guards sworn the corpse of Luther Painbright to defend his son, there had never been treason among the guards. Never. More relaxed by increments as he realized that Farid did not intend to kill him, at least not right then. But there was a haze of sweat on his forehead. I have heard it said a Death Watch guard can see a butterfly's breath. Do you have anything to drink? Farid gestured curtly to the brick hearth, where a silver cup and pitcher sat near the flames to keep warm. They had been there untouched since Ajimbora brought them when Farid awoke. The wine may be cool by now, but be free of it. And when your throat is wet, you will answer my question. Either you suspect guardsmen, or you wish to play me in some game of your own. And by my eyes, I will know which and why. The fellow sidled to the hearth, watching him from the corner of his eye, but as Moore bent to the pitcher, he frowned, and then gave a small start. What appeared to be a silver-rimmed bowl with a ram's horn-patterned silver base sat beside the cup. Light of heaven, Ajimbora had been told often enough to keep that thing out of sight. There was no doubt that Moore recognized it for what it was. The man considered treason possible for the guards? Or for me as well, if you will. Moore blinked, showing a faint consternation. He held only the obvious cup. And then a light of understanding appeared in his eyes. An uneasy light. He filled the bowl, too, a trifle unsteadily, and wiped his hand on his coat before taking it up. Every man had his limits, even a seeker, and the man pushed to them was especially dangerous, but he was also off balance. Accepting the skull cup with both hands, Farid raised it high and lowered his head. To the Empress, may she live forever in honor and glory. Death and shame to her enemies. To the Empress, may she live forever in honor and glory, Moore echoed, bowing his head and lifting his cup. Death and shame to her enemies. Putting out Jimbura's cup to his lips, Farid was aware of the other man watching him drink. The wine was indeed cool, the spices bitter, and there was a faint, acrid hint of silver polish. He told himself the taste of dead man's dust was his imagination. Moore dashed off half his own wine in hurried gulps, then stared at his cup, seemed to realize what he had done, and made a visible effort to regain control of himself. Turik Karid, he said briskly. Born 42 years ago to weavers, the property of one Jalid Naganine, a craftsman in Ankarid. Chosen at 15 for training in the Death Watch Guards, cited twice for heroism and mentioned in dispatches 3 times. Then, as a 7-year veteran, named to the bodyguard of the High Lady Tuan upon her birth. That had not been her name then, of course, but mentioning her birth name would have been an insult. That same year, as one of 3 survivors of the first known attempt on her life, chosen for training as an officer. Service during the Miami Uprising and the Jiangmin incident. More citations for heroism. More mentions in dispatches, and assignment back to the High Lady's bodyguard just before her first true name day. Moore peered into his wine, then looked up suddenly. At your request. Unusual, that. The following year, you took 3 serious wounds, shielding her with your body against another set of assassins. She gave you her most precious possession, a doll. After more distinguished service, with further citations and mentions, you were selected for the bodyguard of the Empress herself, may she live forever, and served there until named to accompany the High Lord Turak to these lands with the Halim. Times change, and men change. But before going to guard the throne, you made 2 other requests for assignment to the High Lady Tuan's bodyguard. Most unusual. And you kept the doll until it was destroyed in the Great Fire of Sahima. A matter of 10 years. Not for the first time, Farid was glad of the training that allowed him to maintain a smooth face no matter what. Garrow's expressions gave away too much to an opponent. He remembered the face of the small girl who had laid that doll on his litter. He could hear her still. You have protected my life, so you must take Emila to watch over you in turn, she said. She can't really protect you, of course. She's only a doll. But keep her to remind you that I will always hear if you speak my name. If I'm still alive, of course. My honor is loyalty, he said, setting Hachimura's cup on the writing table carefully so as not to slop wine onto his papers. However often the fellow polished the silver, Farid did not think he bothered to wash the thing. Loyalty to the throne. Why did you come to me? Moore moved slightly, so the armchair was between them. No doubt he thought he was standing casually, but he was clearly ready to throw the wine cup. He had a knife under his coat in the small of his back, and probably at least 1 other. 3 requests to join the High Lady Tuan's bodyguard. And you kept the doll. That much I understand, Farid told him dryly. The guards were not supposed to form attachments to those they were sent to guard. The Death Watch Guard served only the Crystal Throne, served whoever succeeded to the Crystal Throne with a whole heart and a whole faith. But he remembered that serious child's face, already aware she might not live to do her duty, yet trying to do it anyway. And he had kept the doll. But there's more to it than rumor of a girl, isn't there? A butterfly's breath, the fellow murmured. It is a pleasure to talk to someone who sees deeply. On the night that Tylan was murdered, 2 Damani were taken from the Tarasan Palace kennels. Both were formerly Aes Sedai. Do you not find the coincidence too much? I find any coincidence suspect, Amarat. But what has that to do with rumors and other matters? This web is more tangled than you imagine. Several others left the palace that night, among them a young man who was apparently Tylan's pet. 4 men who were certainly soldiers, and an older man, one Tom Maryland, or so he called himself, who was supposedly a servant, but who displayed much more education than would be expected. At one time or another, they were all seen with Aes Sedai, who were in the city before the Empire reclaimed it. Intent, the speaker leaned forward slightly over the back of the armchair. Perhaps Taryn was not murdered because she swore fealty, but because she had learned of things that were dangerous. She might have been careless in what she revealed to the boy on the pillows, and he carried word to Marilyn. We can call him that until we learn a better name. The more I learn of that one, the more intriguing he is. Knowledgeable of the world, well-spoken, at ease with nobles and crowns. A courtier, in fact, if you didn't know he was a servant. If the White Tower has certain plans in Ibudar, they might send such a man to carry them out. Plans. Unthinking, Farid picked up Ajimbura's cup and almost drank before he realized what he was doing. He continued to hold the cup, though, so as not to give away his turmoil. Everyone, those who knew anyway, was sure the High Lady Tuon's disappearance was part of the contest to succeed the Empress, might she live forever. Such was life in the Imperial family. If the High Lady were dead, after all, a new heir must be named. If she were dead. And if not, the White Tower would have sent their best if they planned to carry her away. If the Seeker was not playing him in some game of his own. Seekers could try to snare anyone short of the Empress herself, might she live forever. You have taken this notion to your superiors, and they rejected it, or you would not come to me. That, or you haven't mentioned it to them, have you? Why not? Much more tangled than you can imagine, Moore said softly, eyeing the door as if suspecting eavesdroppers. Why did he grow cautious now? There are many complications. The two demoni were removed by the Lady Eginin Tamarak, who has had dealings with Aes Sedai before. Close dealings, in fact. Very close. Clearly, she released the other demoni to cover her escape. Eginin left the city that same night with 3 demoni in her entourage, and also, we believe, Marilyn and the others. We don't know who the 3rd demoni was. We suspect someone important among the Hapa-on-the-Air, or perhaps an Aes Sedai who was hiding in the city. But we have identified the Suldam she used, and 2 have close connections with Suroth, who herself has many connections to Aes Sedai. For all his wariness, Moore said that as if it were not a lightning bolt. No wonder he was on edge. So, Suroth plotted with Aes Sedai and had corrupted at least some of the Seekers above Moore, and the White Tower had placed men under one of their best to carry out certain actions. It was all believable. When Creed was sent with the Forerunners, he had been asked to watch the blood for overambition. There had always been a possibility, this far from the Empire, that they would try to set up their own kingdoms. And he himself had sent men into a city he knew would fall, whatever was done to defend it, so they could harm the enemy from within. You have a direction, Almarat. Moore shook his head. They went north, and Johanna was mentioned in the palace stables, but that seems an obvious attempt at deception. They will have changed direction at the first opportunity. We have checked on boats large enough to have carried the party across the river, but vessels of that size come and go all the time. There is no order in this place, no control. This gives me a great deal to think on. The Seeker grimaced, a slight twisting of his mouth, but he seemed to realize he had gotten as much commitment as Creed would make. He nodded once. Whatever you choose to do, you should know this. You may wonder how the girl extorted anything from these merchants. It seems 2 or 3 soldiers always accompanied her. The description of their armor was also very precise. He half stretched out a hand as though to touch Khalid's robe, but wisely let it fall back to his side. Most people call that black. You understand me? Whatever you choose to do, do not delay. Moore raised his cup. Your health, Banner General. Correct. Your health. And the health of the Empire. Khalid drained Ajimbura's cup without hesitation. The Seeker departed as abruptly as he had entered. Moments after the door closed behind him, it opened to admit Ajimbura. The little man stared accusingly at the skull cup in Kareed's hands. "Do you know this rumor, Ajumbura?" As well ask whether the sun rose in the morning as ask whether the fellow had been listening. He did not deny it in any case. "I would not soil my tongue with such filth, High One," he said, drawing himself up. Kareed permitted himself a sigh. Whether the High Lady Tuon's disappearance was her own doing or some other's, she was in great danger. And if the rumor was some ploy by Moore, the best way to defeat another's game was to make the game your own. "Lay out my razor." Sitting down, he reached for his pen, holding the sleeve of his robe clear of the ink with his left hand. "Then you will find Captain Musenchi. When he is alone, and give him this. Return quickly. I will have more instructions for you." Shortly after noon on the following day, he was crossing the harbor on the ferry that departed each hour, according to the strict ringing of bells. It was a lumbering barge that heaved as long sweeps propelled it across the harbor's choppy surface. The ropes lashing a merchant's half-dozen canvas-covered wagons to the cleats on the deck creaked with every shift. The horses stamped their hooves nervously, and the oarsmen had to fend off wagon drivers and hired guards who wanted to empty their bellies over the side. Some men had no stomach for the motion of water. The merchant herself, a plump-faced woman with a coppery skin, stood in the bow, wrapped in her dark cloak, balancing easily with the ferry's movements, staring fixedly at the approaching landing and ignoring Kareed beside her. She might know that he was Sean-chan, from the saddle on his bay gelding, if nothing else, but a plain gray cloak covered his red-trimmed green coat. So if she thought of him at all, it was as an ordinary soldier, not a settler with a sword on his hip. There might have been sharper eyes back in the city, despite all he had done to evade them, but there was nothing he could do about that. With luck, he had a day, perhaps two, before anyone realized he would not be returning to the inn anytime soon. Swinging into his saddle as soon as the ferry bumped hard against the landing dock's leather-padded posts, he was first off when the loading gate swung wide. The merchant was still chivying her drivers to the wagons and the ferryman unlashing wheels. He kept Aldazar to a slow walk across the stones, still slippery with the morning's rain, a litter of horse dung, and the leavings of a flock of sheep, and let the base pace increase only when he reached the Ilion road itself, though he kept short of a trot even then. Impatience was a vice when beginning a journey of unknown length. Inns lined the road beyond the landing, flat-roofed buildings covered in cracked and flaking white plaster and with faded signs out front, or none at all. This road marked the northern edge of the Rahat, and roughly dressed men slouching on benches in front of the inns sullenly watched him pass. Not because he was Sean-chan. He suspected they would have been no brighter for anyone on horseback. Anyone who had 2 coins to rub, for that matter. Soon he left them behind, though, and the next few hours took him past olive orchards and small farms where the workers were accustomed enough to passers-by on the road, but they did not look up from their labors. The traffic was sparse in any case, a handful of high-wheeled farmers' carts and twice a merchant's train rumbling toward Abu Dar, surrounded by hired guards. Many of the drivers and both merchants wore distinctive Ilion beards. It seemed strange that Ilion continued to send its trade to Abu Dar while fighting to resist the empire. But people on this side of the Eastern Sea were often peculiar, with odd customs, and little like the stories told of the great Hawkwing's homeland. Often nothing like. They must be understood, of course, if they were to be brought into the empire, but understanding was for others, higher than he. He had his duty. The farms gave way to woodlands and fields of scrub, and his shadow was lengthening in front of him, the sun more than halfway to the horizon by the time he saw what he was looking for. Just ahead, Ajimbura was squatting on the north side of the road, playing a reed flute, the image of an idler shirking. Before Kareed reached him, he tucked the flute behind his belt, gathered his brown cloak, and vanished into the brush and trees. Glancing behind to make sure the road was empty in that direction as well, Kareed turned Aldazar into the woodland at the same point. The little man was waiting just out of sight of the road, among a stand of some sort of large pine tree, the tallest easily 100 feet. He made his hunch-shouldered bow and scrambled into the saddle of a lean chestnut with 4 white feet. He insisted that white feet on a horse were lucky. "This way, High One," he said, and at Kareed's gesture of permission, turned his mount deeper into the forest. They had only a short way to ride, no more than half a mile, but but no one passing on the road could have suspected what waited there in a large clearing. Misenji had brought 100 of the guard on good horses and 20 Ogier gardeners, all in full armor, along with pack animals to carry supplies for 2 weeks. The pack horse Ajimbura had brought out yesterday with Kharid's honor would be among them. A cluster of Suldan were standing beside their own mounts, some petting the 6-leashed Damani. When Misenji rode forward to meet Kharid with Hartha, the first gardener, striding grim-faced beside him with his green-tasseled axe over his shoulder, one of the women, Melatine, the High Lady Tuan's Der Suldan, stepped into her saddle and joined them. Misenji and Hartha touched fists to heart, and Kharid returned their salute, but his eyes went to the Damani, to one in particular, a small woman whose hair was being stroked by a dark, square-faced Sultan. A Damani's face was always deceptive. They aged slowly and lived a very long time. But this one had a difference he had learned to recognize as belonging to those who called themselves Aes Sedai. "What excuse did you use to get all of them out of the city at once?" he asked. "Exercise, Banner General," Palatine replied with a wry smile. "Everyone always believes exercise." It was said the High Lady Tuan in truth needed no Der Suldan to train her property or her Sultan, but Melatine, with less black than gray in her long hair, was experienced in more than her craft, and she knew what he was really asking. He had requested that Misenji bring a pair of Damani if he could. "None of us would be left behind, Banner General. Never for this. As for Mylan," that must be the former Aes Sedai, "after we left the city, we told the Damani why we were going. It's always best if they know what's expected. We've been calming Mylan ever since. She loves the High Lady. They all do. But Mylan worships
I'll be
her,
right
so
back.
she already sat on the crystal throne. If Mylan gets her hands on one of those Aes Sedai," she chuckled, "we'll have to be quick to keep the woman from being too battered to be worth leashing." "I sense no cause for laughter," Arthur rumbled. The Ogier was even more weathered and grizzled than Misenji, with long gray mustaches and eyes like black stones staring out of his helmet. He had been a gardener since before Kharid's father was born, maybe before his grandfather. "We have no target. We are trying to catch the wind in a net." Melatine sobered quickly, and Misenji began to look grimmer than Hartha if that was possible. In 10 days, the people they sought would have put many miles between them. The best the White Tower could send would not be so blatant as to head due east after trying the ruse of Jahanna, nor so stupid as to head too close to north, yet that left a vast and ever-expanding area to be searched. "Then we must begin spreading our nets without delay," Kharid said, "and spread them finely." Misenji and Hartha nodded. For the Death Watch Guard, what must be done would be done, even to catching the wind. Chapter 5. The Forging of a Hammer. He ran easily through the night in spite of the snow that covered the ground. He was one with the shadows, slipping through the forest, the moonlight almost as clear to his eyes as the light of the sun. A cold wind ruffled his thick fur, and suddenly brought a scent that made his hackles stand and his heart race with a hatred greater than that for the Neverborn. Hatred, and a sure knowledge of death coming. There were no choices to be made. Not now. He ran harder toward death. Perrin awoke abruptly in the deep darkness before dawn, beneath one of the high-wheeled supply carts. Cold had seeped into his bones from the ground, despite his heavy fur-lined cloak and 2 blankets. And there was a fitful breeze, not strong nor steady enough to be called a light wind, but icy. When he scrubbed at his face with his gauntleted hands, frost crackled in his short beard. At least it seemed not to have snowed any more during the night. Too often he had awakened covered with a dusting despite the shelter of a cart, and snowfall made things difficult for the scouts. He wished he could speak with Elias the same way he talked with wolves. Then he would not have to endure this endless waiting. Weariness clung to him like a second skin. He could not recall when he had last had a sound night's sleep. Sleep, or the lack of it, seemed unimportant anyway. These days, only the heat of anger gave him the strength to keep moving. He did not think it was the dream that had wakened him. Every night he lay down expecting nightmares, and every night they came. In the worst, he found Fail dead, or never found her. Those woke him up in shivering sweats. Anything less horrible, he slept through, or only half woke, with Trollocs cutting him up alive for the cookbot, or a Drakkar eating his soul. This dream was fading quickly, in the manner of dreams, yet he remembered being a wolf and smelling... what? Something wolves hated more than they did Myrddraal. Something a wolf knew would kill him. The knowledge he had had in the dream was gone. Only vague impressions remained. He had not been in the wolf dream, that reflection of this world where dead wolves lived on, and the living could go to consult them. The wolf dream always remained clear in his head after he left, whether he had gone there consciously or not. Yet this dream still seemed real, and somehow urgent. Lying motionless on his back, he sent his mind questing, feeling for wolves. He had tried using wolves to help his hunt, to no avail. Convincing them to take an interest in the doings of two legs was difficult, to say the least. They avoided large parties of men, and for them 6 was large enough to stay clear of. Men chased away game, and most men tried to kill a wolf on sight. His thoughts found nothing, but then, after a time, he touched wolves at a distance. How far, he could not be sure, but it was like catching a whisper almost on the edge of hearing. A long way. That was strange. Despite scattered villages and manors, and even the occasional town, this was prime country for wolves, untouched forest for the most part, with plenty of deer and smaller game. There was always a formality to speaking with a pack you were not part of. Politely, he sent his name among wolves, Young Bull, shared his scent, and received theirs in reply, Leaf Hunter, and Tall Bear, Whitetail and Feather, and Thunder Mist, a cascade of others. It was a sizable pack, and Leaf Hunter, a female with a feel of quiet certainty, was their leader. Feather, clever and in his prime, Young Bull, were eager to speak with the friend of the fabled Long Tooth. The first two legs would learn to speak with wolves after a gap of time that carried the feel of ages vanished into the mists of the past. It was all a torrent of images and memories of sense that his mind turned into words, as the words he thought somehow became images and sense they could understand. There is something I want to learn, he thought, once the greetings were done. What would a wolf hate more than the Neverborn? He tried to recall the scent from the dream, to add that, but it was gone from his memory. Something that a wolf knows means death. Silence answered him, and the threat of fear blended with hatred and determination and reluctance. He had felt fear from wolves before. Above all things, they feared the wildfire that raced through a forest, or so he would have said. But this was the prickling sort of fear that made a man's skin crawl, made him shiver and jump at things unseen. Laced with the resolution to go on no matter what, it felt close to terror. Wolves never experienced that kind of dread, except that these did. One by one they faded from his consciousness, a deliberate act of shutting him out, until only Leaf Hunter remained. The last hunt is coming, she said at last, and then she also was gone. Did I offend? He said. If I did, it was in ignorance. But there was no reply. These wolves, at least, would not speak with him again. Not any time soon. The last hunt is coming. That was what wolves called the last battle, Tarmangaiden. They knew they would be there, at the final confrontation between the light and the shadow, though why was something they could not explain. Some things were fated, as sure as the rise and fall of the sun and the moon, and it was fated that many wolves would die in the last hunt. What they feared was something else. Aaron had a strong sense that he also had to be there, was meant to be at least. But if the last battle came soon, he would not be. He had a job of work in front of him that he could not shirk, would not, even for Tarmangaiden. Putting nameless fears and the last battle alike out of his mind, he fumbled his gauntlets off and felt in his coat pocket for the length of rawhide cord he kept there. In a morning ritual, his fingers made another knot mechanically and slid down the cord, counting. 22 knots. 22 mornings since Fail was kidnapped. At the start, he had not thought there was need to keep count. That first day, he had believed he was cold and numb, but focused.
John McDowell, how you
Yet
doing?
looking back, he could see he had been overwhelmed by unbound rage and a consuming need to find the Shido as
I'm
fast
not
as
doing
possible.
too bad. Can't
Men from
complain.
other clans had been among the Aiel who had stolen Fail, Yet on the evidence,
You're here,
most were
let's get a
Shido,
dab.
and that was how he thought of them. The need to rip Fail away from them,
Doing out
forcing
of
to be hurt, had gripped him by the throat till he
monster.
almost choked. He would rescue the other women
How
captured
you're
with her,
even
of course.
going?
Sometimes he had to list their names in his head to make sure he did not forget them entirely. Alejandra Maritha Kagara, Queen of Gildan, and his liege woman. It still seemed off-kilter to have anyone oath-sworn to him, especially a queen. He was a blacksmith. He had been a blacksmith once. But he had responsibilities toward Alejandra, and she would never have been in danger except for him. Bane, of the Black Rock Sharat, and Chiad, of the Stones River Goshin, Aiel maidens of the Spear who followed Fail to Gildan and Amadisia. They had faced Trollocs in the Two Rivers as well, when Perrin needed every hand that could raise a weapon, and that earned them the right to call on him. Arla Shigo and Lucille Alderwin, two foolish young women who thought they could learn to be Aiel, or some strange version of Aiel. They were oath-sworn to Fail, and so was Migdin Dolan, a penniless refugee Fail had taken under her wing as one of her maids. He could not abandon Fail's people. Fail ni Bashir Tabara. The litany came back to her, his wife, the breath of his life. With a groan, he clutched the cord so tightly that the knots impressed themselves painfully on a hand hardened by long days swinging the hammer at a forge.
My
Light.
Puffco
22
proxy.
days. Working iron had
This
taught him
was-
that haste
Yeah,
ruins
this will stay
metal,
on for a little
but in the
bit.
beginning he had been hasty, traveling southward through gateways created by Grady and Niald, the Tuashaman, to where the farthest traces of the Shido had been found, then leaping south again,
Now I just
the
gotta
direction
heat
their
up.
tracks went, as soon as the Ashaman could make more gateways. Spreading every hour it took them to rest from making the first, holding them open long enough for everyone to pass through, his mind was eaten up with freeing Fail at any cost. What he found were days of increasing pain as the scouts spread farther and farther through uninhabited wilderness without locating the slightest sign that anyone had been that way before, until he knew he had to retrace his path, frittering away more days to cover ground Yashaman had taken him across in a step, searching for any indication of where the Shido had turned aside. He should have known they would turn. South took them toward warmer lands, without the snow that seemed so strange to him, but it took them closer to the Tronshan as well. He knew about the Tronshan, and he should have expected the Shido to learn. They were after pillage, not a fight with Shonchan and Damani. Days of slow marching with the scouts fanning out ahead, days when falling snow blinded even the Aiel and forced them all to a chafing halt, until finally Jundin Baron found a tree scraped by a wagon. Elias dug a broken Aiel spear shaft from beneath the snow. And Perrin at last turned east, at most 2 days south of where he had traveled for the first time. He had wanted to howl when he realized that, but he kept a tight hold on himself. He could not give way, not so much as himself, not when Fail was depending on him. That was when he began to husband his anger, began to forge it. His kidnappers had gained a long lead because he was hasty, but since then he had been as careful as he had been in the smithy. His anger was hardened and shaped to a purpose. Since finding the Shido's trail again, he had traveled no farther in one jump than the scouts could come and go between sunrise and sunset. And it was well that he had been cautious, because the Shido changed directions suddenly several times, zigzagging almost as though they could not decide on a destination. Or maybe they had turned to join others of their kind. All he had to go by were old traces, old camps buried by snow. Yet all of the scouts agreed the Shido's
I have
numbers were swollen.
the older one,
There
but
had
it
to be at
still
least
works
2 or
pretty
3
good.
sets together, maybe more.
I've seen the
formidable
newer
warrior.
one, and the newer one looks pretty
Slowly but
nice.
surely, though, he had begun overtaking them. That was what was important. The Shido covered more ground on the march than he would have thought possible, given their numbers in the snow, yet they did not seem to care whether anyone was tracking them. Perhaps they believed no one dared. Sometimes they had camped several days in one spot. Anger forged to a purpose. Ruined villages and small towns and estates littered the Shido's path as if they were human locusts. Storehouses and valuables looted, men and women carried off along with the livestock. Often no one remained by the time he arrived, only empty houses, the people seeking somewhere for food to survive until spring. He had crossed the Eldar into Altara, where a small ferry used by peddlers and local farmers, not merchants, once ran between 2 villages on the forested riverbanks. How the Shido had gotten across, he did not know. But he had the Ashaman make gateways. All that remained of the ferry were the rough stone landings on either bank, and the few unburned structures were deserted except for 3 slat-ribbed feral dogs that slunk away at the sight of humans. Anger hardened and shaped for a hammer. Yesterday morning, he had come to a tiny village where a double handful of stunned, dirty-faced people had stared at the hundreds of lancers and bowmen riding out of the forest at first light, behind the red eagle of Manethron and the crimson wolf's head, the silver stars of Gildan and the golden hawk of Mayen, followed by long lines of high-wheeled carts and strings of remounts. At first sight of Gaul and the other Aiel, those people overcame their paralysis and began running for the trees in panic. Catching a few to answer questions had been difficult. They were ready to run themselves to death rather than let an Aiel near. Brighton had consisted of only a dozen families, but the Shido had carried off 9 young men and women from there, along with all of their animals, only 2 days ago. 2 days. A hammer was a tool with a purpose and a target. He knew he had to be careful, or lose Fael forever, but being too careful could lose her too. Early yesterday, he had told those who were going ahead to scout that they were to go farther than before, push on harder, returning only with a full turn of the sun, unless they found the Shido sooner. In a little while the sun would rise, and at most a few hours after that, Elias and Gull and the others would return. The maidens and 2 rivers men he knew could track a shadow across water. As fast as the Shido moved, the scouts could move faster. They were not encumbered with families and wagons and captives. This time they would be able to tell him exactly where the Shido were. They would. He knew it in his bones. The certainty flowed in his veins. He would find Fael and free her. That came before anything, even living, so long as he lived long enough to accomplish it. Yet he was a hammer now, and if there was any way to accomplish it any way at all, he intended to hammer these Shido into scrap. Tossing the blankets aside, Perrin tugged his gauntlets back on, gathered his axe from where it lay beside him, a half-moon blade balanced by a heavy spike, and rolled out into the open, rising to his feet on trampled, frozen snow. Carts stood all around him in rows, in what had been Brighton's fields. The arrival of more strangers, so many, and armed with their foreign banners, had been more than the survivors of the little village could absorb. As soon as Perrin would let them, the pitiful remnant had fled into the forest, carrying what they could on their backs and on drag sleds. They had run as hard as if Perrin was another Shido, not looking back for fear he was following them. As he slipped the axe haft through the thick loop on his belt, a deeper shadow beside a nearby cart grew taller and resolved into a man swathed in a cloak that seemed black in the darkness. Perrin was not surprised. The nearby horse lines thickened the air with the smell of several thousand animals, mounts and remounts and cart horses, not to mention the sweet stink of horse dung, but he still had caught the other's scent on waking. Man's smell always stood out. Besides, Aram was always there when Perrin woke, waiting. A waning sickle moon, low in the sky, still gave enough light for him to make out the other man's face, if not clearly, and the brass-pommeled hilt of his sword slanting up against his shoulder. Aram had been a tinker once, but Perrin did not think he would be again, even if he did wear a brightly striped tinker coat. There was a frowning hardness about Aram now that moon shadows could not hide. He stood as though ready to draw that sword, and since Fael was taken, anger seemed a permanent part of his scent. A great deal had changed when Fael was taken. Anyway, Perrin understood anger. He had not really, before Fael was taken. "They want to see you, Lord Perrin," Aram said, jerking his head toward 2 dim forms farther away between the lines of carts. The words came out in a faint mist in the cold air. "I told them to let you sleep." It was a fault Aram had, looking after him too much, unasked. Testing the air, Perrin separated out the scents of those 2 shadows from the masking smell of the horses. "I'll see them now. Have Steppa ready for me, Aram." He tried to be in the saddle before the rest of the camp woke. Partly that was because standing still for long seemed beyond him. Standing still was not catching the Shido. Partly it was to avoid having to share anyone's company he could avoid. He would have gone out with the scouts himself if the men and women already doing that job were not so much better at it than he. "Yes, my lord." A jaggedness entered Aram's scent as he trudged away across the snow, but Perrin barely noticed it. Only something important would make Seven Bulwer root himself out of his blankets in the dark. And as for Solanda Berengill, Bulwer appeared skinny, even in a bulky coat, his pinched face all but hidden in the deep hood. Had he stood straight instead of hunching, he still would have been at most a hand taller than the Kyrianan woman, who was not tall. With his arms wrapped around himself, he was hopping from one foot to the other, trying to avoid the cold that must be soaking through his boots. Solanda, in a man's dark coat and breeches, made a good effort at ignoring the temperature despite the feathery white that marked every breath. She was shivering, but managed to swagger standing still, with one side of her cloak thrown back, and a gloved hand on the hilt of her sword. The hood of her cloak was lowered too, exposing hair cut short except for the tail on the back that was tied at the nape of her neck with a dark ribbon. Solanda was the leader of those fools who wanted to be imitation Aiel who carried swords. Her scent was soft and thick, like a jelly. She was worried. Bulwer smelled intent, but then he nearly always did, though there was never any heat to his intensity, only focus. The skinny little man stopped hopping to make a stiff, hurried bow. "The Lady Solanda has news I think you should hear from her lips, my lord." Bulwer's thin voice was dry and precise, just like its owner. He would sound the same with his neck on a headsman's block. "My lady, if you would." He was only a secretary, Fail's secretary, and Perrin's, a fussy, self-effacing fellow for the most part. And Solanda was a noblewoman, but Bulwer made that more than a request. She gave him a sharp sideways glance, shifting her sword, and Perrin tensed to grab her. He did not think she would actually draw on the man, but then again, he was not sure enough of her, or any of her ridiculous friends, to put it out of the question. Bulwer merely watched her, his head tilted to one side, and his smell carried impatience, not concern. With a toss of her head, Solanda turned her attention to Perrin. "I see you, Lord Perrin Goldeneyes," she began in the crisp accents of Carian, but aware that he had little patience for her pretend Aiel formality, she hurried on. "I have learned 3 things tonight. First, the least important. Aviar reported that Massima sent another rider back toward Amadisia yesterday. Nerion tried to follow, but lost him." "Tell Nerion I said he isn't to follow anybody," Perrin told her sharply. "And tell Javier the same. They should know that. They are to watch, listen, and report what they see and hear, no more. Do you understand me?" Solanda gave a quick nod, a thorn of fear entering her scent for a moment. Fear of him, Perrin supposed, fear that he was angry with her. Yellow eyes in a man made some people uneasy. He took his hand from his axe and clasped both hands behind his back. Javier and Nerion were more of Fail's 24 young fools, one Tylan, the other Kyrianan. Fail had used a lot of them for eyes and ears, a fact that still irritated him for some reason, though she had told him to his face that spying was a wife's business. A man needed to listen hard when he thought his wife was joking. She might not be. The whole notion of spying made him uncomfortable, but if Fail could use them so, then so could her husband, when there was need. Just the two, though. Massima seemed convinced that everyone except dark friends were fated to follow him sooner or later, yet he might grow suspicious if too many left Perrin's camp to join him. "Don't call him Massima, not even here," he added brusquely. Lately the man claimed Massima Dagar was actually dead and risen from the grave as the prophet of the Lord Dragon reborn, and he was touchier than ever about mention of his former name. "You get careless with your tongue in the wrong place, and you might be lucky if he just has a few of his bully boys flog you the next time they can find you alone." Solanda nodded again, gravely, and this time without any fear smell. Right, those idiots of Fail's lacked the sense to recognize what they should be afraid of. "It's almost dawn," Bulwer murmured, shivering and pulling his cloak tighter. "All will be waking before long, and some matters are best discussed unseen. If my lady will continue?" Once again, that was more than a suggestion. Solanda and the rest of Fail's hangers-on had been good only for causing trouble, that Perrin could see, and Bulwer looked to be trying to put a fly up her nose for some reason, but she actually gave an embarrassed start and murmured an apology. The darkness truly was beginning to lessen, Perrin realized, at least to his eyes. The sky overhead still looked black, dusted with bright stars, yet he could almost make out the colors of the 6 thin stripes that crossed the front of Solanda's coat. He could tell one from another anyway. The realization that he had slept later than usual made him growl. He could not afford to give in to weariness, however tired he was. He needed to hear Solanda's report. She would not be worried about Massima sending out riders. The man did that almost every day. Yet he looked anxiously for Aram and Stepper. His ears picked up the sounds of activity among the horse lines, but there was no sign of his horse yet. "The second thing, my lord," Solanda said, "is that Javier has seen casks of salt fish and salt beef, branded with Altaran markings, a great many of them. He says there are Altarans among the Prophet's people too. Several appear to be craftsfolk, and one or two could be merchants or town officials. Established men and women in any case, solid folk. And some seem unsure they made the right decision. A few questions might reveal from where the fish and beef came, and perhaps gain more eyes and ears for you." "I know where the fish and beef came from, and so do you," Perrin said irritably. His hands knotted into fists behind his back. He had hoped the speed with which he was moving would keep Massima from sending out raiding parties. That was what they were, and as bad as the Shido, if not worse. They offered people a chance to swear to the Dragon Reborn, and those who refused, sometimes those who simply hesitated too long, died by fire and steel. In any case, whether or not they marched off to follow Massima, those who swore were expected to donate generously in support of the Prophet's cause, while those who died were plainly dark friends, their belongings forfeit. Thieves lost a hand by Massima's laws, but none of what his raiders did was thieving, according to Massima. By his laws, murder and a whole host of other crimes merited hanging, yet a fair number of his followers seemed to prefer killing to receiving oaths. There was more loot that way, and for some of them, murder was a fine game to play before eating. "Tell them to keep clear of these Altarans," Perrin went on. "All sorts drift into Massima's following, and even if they are having second thoughts, it won't take them long to stink of zeal like the rest. They wouldn't hesitate to gut a neighbor then, much less somebody who's asked the wrong questions. What I want to know is what Massima's doing, what he's planning." But the man had some scheme that seemed obvious. Massima claimed it was blasphemy for anyone except Rand to touch the One Power, claimed he wanted nothing more than to join Rand in the East. As always, thought of Rand brought colors swirling through Perrin's head, more vividly than usual this time, but anger melted them to vapor. Blasphemy or no, Massima had accepted traveling, which was not just channeling, but men channeling. And no matter what he claimed, he had done it to remain in the West as long as possible, not to help rescue Fail. Perrin tended to trust people until they proved unreliable, but one sniff of Massima had told him the fellow was as insane as a rabid animal, and less trustworthy. He had considered ways to stop that scheme, whatever it was, ways to stop Massima's killing and burning. Massima had 10 or 12,000 men with him, maybe more. The man was not very forthcoming about numbers, and the way they camped in a squalid sprawl made counting impossible. While less than a quarter of that number followed Perrin, several hundred of them cart drivers and grooms and others who would be more hindrance than help in a fight. Yet with 3 Aes Sedai and 2 Ashaman, not to mention 6 Aiel Wise Ones, he could halt Massima in his tracks. The Wise Ones and 2 of the Aes Sedai would be eager to take part, more than simply willing, at least. They wanted Massima dead, but dispersing Massima's army would only break it into hundreds of smaller bands that would scatter across Altara and beyond, still looting and killing, just for themselves instead of in the name of the Dragon Reborn. Breaking the Shido will do the same thing, he thought, and pushed the thought away. Stopping Massima would take time he did not have. The man would have to keep until Fail was safe, until the Shido was smashed to kindling. "What's the third thing you learned tonight, Solanda?" he said roughly. To his surprise, the smell of worry coming from the woman thickened. "Javier saw someone," she said slowly. "He did not tell me at first." Her voice hardened for a moment. "I made sure that will not happen again." Drawing a deep breath, she seemed to struggle with herself, then burst out. "Masuri Sedai has visited Massima, the Prophet. It is true, my lord, believe me. Javier has seen her more than once. She slips into their camp hooded and leaves the same way. But he has had a good look at her face twice. A man accompanies her each time, and sometimes another woman. Javier has not seen the man well enough to be sure, but the description fits Rover, Masuri's warder, and Javier is certain the second woman is a Nura Sedai." She broke off abruptly, her eyes shining darkly in the moonlight as she watched him. Like she was as worried about how he would take it as by what it meant. He forced his hands to unclench. Massima despised Aes Sedai as much as he did dark friends. He nearly considered them dark friends. So why would he receive two sisters? Why would they go to him? Anura's opinion of Massima lay hidden behind Aes Sedai mystery and double-jointed comments that could mean anything. But Masuri had said straight out that the man needed to be put down like a mad dog. Make sure Javier and Nerion keep a sharp eye for the sisters, and see if they can eavesdrop on one of their meetings with Massima. Would Javier be mistaken? No. There were few women in Massima's camp, relatively speaking, and it passed belief that the tyrant could mistake one of those unwashed, murderous-eyed harridans for Masuri. The sort of women willing to march with Massima usually made the men look like tinkers. Tell them to take care, though. Better to let the chance pass than get caught at it. They're no good to anyone strung up on a tree. Perrin knew he sounded gruff and tried to make his voice milder. That seemed harder since Fail was kidnapped. You've done well, Salanda. At least he did not sound as if he were barking at her. You and Javier and Nerion. Fail would be proud if she knew. A smile lit up her face, and she stood a little straighter, if that was possible. Pride, clean and bright, the pride of accomplishment, almost overwhelmed any other scent from her. Thank you, my lord. Thank you. You would have thought he had given her a prize. Maybe he had, come to think on it. Though, come to think, Fail might not be best pleased that he was using her eyes and ears, or even knew about them. Once the thought of Fail displeased would have made him uneasy, but that was before he learned about her spies, and that little matter of the broken crown that Elias had let slip. Everybody always said that wives kept their secrets close, but there were limits. Adjusting his cloak on his narrow shoulders with one hand, Bulwer coughed behind the other. Well said, my lord. Very well said. My lady, I'm sure you want to pass on Lord Perrin's instructions as soon as possible. It wouldn't do for there to be any misunderstanding. Salanda nodded without taking her eyes off Perrin. Her mouth opened, and Perrin was sure she intended to say something about hoping he found water and shade. Light. Water was the one thing they had in plenty, even if it was mostly frozen. This time of year, nobody needed shade even at noon. She probably did intend it because she hesitated before saying, Grace favor you, my lord. If I may be so bold, Grace has favored the Lady Fail and you. Perrin jerked his head in a nod of thanks. There was a taste of ashes in his mouth. Grace had a funny way of favoring Fail, giving her a husband who still had not found her after more than 2 weeks of searching. The maidens said she had been made Gaishan, that she would not be mistreated, but they had to admit these Shido already had broken their customs 100 different ways. In his book, being kidnapped was mistreatment enough. Bitter ashes. The lady will do very well, my lord, Bulwer said softly, watching Salanda vanish into the darkness among the carts. This approval was a surprise. He had tried to talk Perrin out of using Salanda and her friends on the grounds they were hot-headed and unreliable. She has the necessary instincts. Carrion do, usually, and tyrants to some extent. At least the nobles, especially once. He cut off abruptly, and eyed Perrin cautiously. If he were another man, Perrin would have believed he had said more than he intended, but he doubted Bulwer slipped in that fashion. The man's scent remained steady, not jiggling the way it would in a man who was unsure. May I offer 1 or 2 points on her report, my lord? The crunch of hooves in the snow announced the approach of Aram, leading Perrin's dun stallion and his own rangy gray gelding. The two animals were trying to nip at one another, and Aram was keeping them well apart, though with some difficulty. Bulwer sighed. You can say whatever you need to in front of Aram, Master Bulwer, Perrin said. The little man bowed his head in acquiescence, but he sighed again, too. Everybody in the camp knew that Bulwer had the skill of fitting together rumors and chance-heard comments and things people had done to form a picture of what had really happened or what might. And Bulwer himself considered that part of his job as a secretary, but for some reason he liked to pretend he never did any such thing. It was a harmless pretense, and Perrin tended to humor him. Taking Stepper's reins from Aram, he said, Walk behind us a while, Aram. I need to talk with Master Bulwer in private. Bulwer's sigh was so faint that Perrin barely heard it. Aram fell in behind the two of them without a word as they began to walk, frozen snow cracking beneath their feet. But his scent grew spiky again, and quivery, a thin, sour smell. This time Perrin recognized the scent, though he paid it no more mind than usual. Aram was jealous of anyone except Fail who spent time with him. Perrin saw no way to put a stop to it, in any way. He was as used to Aram's possessiveness as he was to the way Bulwer hopped along at his side, glancing over his shoulder to see whether Aram was close enough to hear when he finally decided to speak. Bulwer's razor-thin scent of suspicion, curiously dry, not even warm, but still suspicious, provided a counterpoint to Aram's jealousy. You could not change him. You did not want to change. The horse lines and supply carts were located in the middle of the camp, where thieves would have a hard time reaching them. And although the sky still looked black to most eyes, the cart drivers and grooms, who slept close to their charges, were already awake and folding their blankets, some tending shelters made of pine boughs, and other small tree limbs harvested from the surrounding forest, in case they might be needed another night. Cook fires were being lit and small black kettles set over them, though there was little to eat except porridge or dried beans. Hunting and trapping added some meat, venison and rabbits, partridges and wood hens and the like, but that could only go so far with so many to feed, and there had been nowhere to buy supplies since before crossing the Eldar. A ripple of bows and curtsies and murmurs of "a good morning, my lord," and "the light favor you, my lord," followed Perrin, but the men and women who saw him stopped trying to strengthen their shelters, and a few began to pull theirs down, as though they had sensed his determination from his stride. They should have known his resolve by now. Since the day he realized how badly he had blundered, he had not spent 2 nights in one place. He returned the greetings without slowing. The rest of the camp made a thin ring around the horses and carts, facing the encircling forest, with the 2 rivers men divided into 4 groups, the lancers from Gildan and Mayenne spaced between them. Whoever came at them, from whatever direction, would face 2 rivers longbows and trained cavalry. It was not a sudden appearance by the Shido that Perrin feared, but rather Massima. The men seemed to be following him meekly enough, but aside from this news of raiding, 9 Gildanen and 8 Mayenners had vanished in the last 2 weeks, and no one believed they had deserted. Before that, on the day Fail was stolen, 20 Mayenners had been ambushed and killed, and no one believed it had been anyone but Massima's men who did the killing. So an uneasy peace existed, a strange, thorny sort of peace, yet a copper wagered on it lasting forever was likely a copper lost. Massima pretended to be unaware of any danger to that peace, but his followers seemed not to care one way or the other, and whatever Massima pretended, they took their lead from him. Somehow, though, Perrin intended to see that it endured until Fail was free. Making his own camp too tough a nut to crack was one way of making the peace last. The Aiel had insisted on having their own thin wedge of the strange pie, though there were fewer than 50 of them, counting the Gaishain who served the wise ones, and he paused to study their low, dark tents. The only other tents erected anywhere in the camp were those of Berelain and her 2 serving women, on the other side of the camp, not far from Brighton's few houses. Fleas and lice in hordes made those uninhabitable, even for hardened soldiers seeking shelter from the cold, and the barns were putrid, ramshackle affairs that let the wind howl through, and harbored worse vermin than the houses. The maidens in Gaul, the only men among the Aiel not Gaishain, were all out with the scouts, and the Aiel tents were silent and still, though the smell of smoke coming from some of the vent holes told them the Gaishain were preparing breakfast for the wise ones, or serving it. Anura was Berelain's advisor, and usually shared her tent, but Masuri and Sioned would be with the wise ones, maybe even helping the Gaishain with breakfast. They still tried to hide the fact that the wise ones considered them apprentices, though everyone in camp must be aware of it by now. Anyone who saw an Aes Sedai actually carrying firewood, or water, or heard one being switched, could make it out. The 2 Aes Sedai were oath-sworn to Rand. Again the colors whirled in his head, an explosion of hues. Again they melted under his constant anger. But Idara and the other wise ones had been sent to keep an eye on them. Only the Aes Sedai themselves knew how tightly their oaths held them, or what room they saw to maneuver between the words, and neither was allowed to hop unless a wise one said toad. Sioned and Masuri had both said Massima should be put down like a mad dog, and the wise ones agreed. Or so they said. They had no 3 oaths to hold them to the truth, though in truth that particular oath held the Aes Sedai more in letter than spirit. And he seemed to recall one of the wise ones telling him that Masuri thought that the mad dog could be leashed. Not allowed to hop unless a wise one said toad. It was like a blacksmith's puzzle with the edges of the metal pieces sharpened. He needed to solve it, but one mistake and he could cut himself to the bone. From the corner of his eye, Perrin caught Bulwer watching him, lips pursed in thought. A bird studying something unfamiliar, not afraid, not hungry, just curious. Gathering Stepper's reins, he walked on so quickly that the little man had to lengthen his stride into small jumps to catch up. Two Rivers men had the segment of camp next to the Aiel, facing northeast. Perrin considered walking a little north to where Gildan and Lancers were camped, or south to the nearest Mayenne section. But taking a deep breath, he made himself lead his horse through his friends and neighbors from home. They were all awake, huddling in their cloaks and feeding the remnants of their shelters into the cook fires, or cutting up the cold remains of last night's rabbit to add to the porridge in the kettles. Talk dwindled, and the smell of wariness grew thick as heads lifted to watch him. Whetstones paused in sliding along steel, then resumed their sibilant whispering. The bow was their preferred weapon, but everyone carried a heavy dagger or a short sword as well, or sometimes a long sword. And they had picked up spears and halberds and other pole arms with strange blades and points that the Shido had not thought worth carrying off with their pillage. Spears they were accustomed to, and hands used to wielding the quarterstaff at feast day competitions found the pole arms not much different once the weight of metal on one end was accounted for. Their faces were hungry, tired, and withdrawn. Someone raised a half-hearted cry of golden eyes, but no one took it up, a thing that would have pleased Perrin a month ago. Changed since Fail was taken. Now their silence was leaden. Young Kenley Merrin, his cheeks still pale where he had scraped off his attempt at a beard, avoided meeting Perrin's eyes, and Jory Conger, light-fingered whenever he saw anything small and valuable, and drunk whenever he could manage it, spat contemptuously as Perrin passed by. Van Craw punched Jory's shoulder for it, hard, but Van did not look at Perrin either. Daniel Lewin stood up, tugging nervously at the thick mustache that looked so ridiculous beneath his beak of a nose. "Orders, Lord Perrin." The skinny man actually looked relieved when Perrin shook his head, and he sat down again quickly, staring at the nearest kettle as though he were anxious for the morning gruel. Maybe he was. Nobody got a full belly lately, and Daniel had never had much spare flesh on his bones. Behind Perrin, Aram made a disgusted sound very like a growl. There were others here besides two Rivers folk, yet they were no better. Old Lamgwin Dorn, a hulking fellow with scars on his face, tugged his forelock and bobbed his head. Lamgwin looked like a shoulder thumper, a tavern tough, but he was Perrin's body servant now, when he had need of one, which was not often, and he might just want to keep in a good odor with his employer. But Basil Gill, the stout one-time innkeeper Fail had taken on as their Chambean, busied himself pulling his blankets with exaggerated care, keeping his balding head down, and Fail's chief maid, Linny Elkring, a bony woman whose tight white bun made her face seem even narrower than it was, straightened from stirring a kettle, her thin lips compressed, and raised her long wooden spoon as if to fend Perrin off. Brianna Taberwin, dark eyes fierce in her pale Carianan face, slapped Lamgwin's arm hard, and frowned up at him. She was Lamgwin's woman, if not his wife, and the second of Fail's three maids. They would follow the Shido till they dropped dead if necessary, and fall on Fail's neck when they found her. But only Lamgwin had an ounce of welcome for Perrin. He might have gotten more from Jur Grady. The Ashenwan were estranged from everyone else themselves, by who and what they were, and neither had shown any animosity toward Perrin. But despite the noise of people tramping about in the frozen snow and cursing when they slept, Grady was still wrapped in his blankets, snoring away beneath a pine branch lean-to. Perrin walked through his friends and neighbors and servants and felt alone. A man could only proclaim his faithfulness so long before he just gave up. The heart of his life lay somewhere to the northeast. Everything would return to normal once he had her back. A thicket of sharpened stakes 10 paces deep encircled the camp, and he went to the edge of the Gildan and Lancers section, where angled paths had been left for mounted men to ride out, though Bulwer and Aram had to fall in behind him in a narrow way. In front of the two Rivers men, a man afoot would have to twist and turn to make it through. The edge of the forest lay little more than 100 paces distant, easy bowshot for two Rivers men, huge trees thrusting a canopy high into the sky. Some of the trees here were strange to Perrin, but there were pines and leatherleaf and elms out there, some as much as 3 or 4 paces thick at the base, and oaks that were larger still. Trees that big killed anything larger than weeds or small bushes that tried to grow beneath them, leaving wide spaces between. But shadows darker than the night filled those spaces. An old forest, one that could swallow armies whole and never give up the bones. Bulwer followed him all the way through the stakes before deciding this was as close to alone with Perrin as he was likely to get any time soon. "The riders Massima has sent out, my lord," he said, and holding his cloak close, he cast a suspicious look back at Aram, who met it with a flat stare. "I know," Perrin said. "You think they're going to the White Cloaks." He was eager to be moving, and that much farther from his friends. He put the hand holding his reins in the saddlebow, but refrained from putting a boot in the stirrup. Stepper tossed his head, also impatient. "Massima could be sending messages to the Shonchan just as easily." "As you have said, my lord, a viable possibility to be sure. May I suggest once again, however, that Massima's view of Aes Sedai is very close to that of the White Cloaks? In fact, identical. He would see every last sister dead if he could. The Shonchan view is more pragmatic, if I may be permitted to call it that. Less in accord with Massima in any case." "However much you hate White Cloaks, Master Bulwer, they aren't at the root of every evil, and Massima has dealt with the Shonchan before." "As you say, my lord." Bulwer's face did not change, but he reeked of doubt. Perrin could not prove Massima's meetings with the Shonchan, and telling anyone how he had learned of them would only add to his present difficulties. That gave Bulwer problems. He was a man who liked evidence. "As for the Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones, my lord, Aes Sedai always seem to believe they know better than anyone else, except possibly another Aes Sedai. I believe the Wise Ones are much the same." Perrin snorted brief white plumes in the air. "Tell me something I don't know, like why Masuri would meet with Massima, and why the Wise Ones allowed it. I'll wager Stepper against a horseshoe nail she didn't do it without their permission." Anura was another question, but she could be acting on her own. It certainly seemed unlikely she was acting at Berline's behest. Shifting his cloak on his shoulders, Bulwer peered back across the rows of sharpened stakes into the camp, toward the Aiel tents, squinting as if he hoped to see through the tent walls. "There are many possibilities, my lord," he said testily. "For some who swear an oath, whatever is not forbidden is permitted, and whatever is not commanded can be ignored. Others take actions they believe will help their liege without first asking permission. The Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones fall into one of those categories, it seems. But further than that, I can only speculate as matters stand." "I could just ask. Aes Sedai can't lie, and if I press hard enough, Masuri might actually tell me the truth." Bulwer grimaced as though at a sudden stomach pain. "Perhaps, my lord, perhaps. More likely is that she would tell you something that sounds like the truth. Aes Sedai are experienced in that, as you know. In any event, my lord, Masuri would wonder how you knew to ask, and that line of thought might lead to Javier and Merion. Under the circumstances, who can say who she might tell? Straightforward is not always the best way. Sometimes certain things must be done behind masks, for safety." "I told you the Aes Sedai couldn't be trusted," Aram said abruptly. "I told you that, Lord Perrin." He fell silent when Perrin raised a hand, but the stink of fury from him was so strong that Perrin had to exhale to clear his lungs. Part of him wanted to draw the scent deep and let it consume him. Perrin studied Bulwer carefully. If Aes Sedai could twist the truth till you could not tell up from down, and they could and did, how far could you trust? Trust was always the question. He had learned that in hard lessons. He took a firm check on his anger, though. A hammer had to be used with care, and he was working a forge where one slip would tear the heart out of his chest. And might matters change if some of Solanda's friends began spending more time among the Aiel? They want to be Aiel, after all. That ought to give them enough excuse. And maybe one of them can strike up a friendship with Berling, and with her advisor. "That should be possible, my lord," Bulwer said after the slightest hesitation. "Lady Midori's father is a High Lord of Tyr, giving her sufficient rank to approach the First of Mayhem, and also a reason. Possibly one or two of the Carianan stand high enough as well. Finding those to live among the Aiel will be easier still." Perrin nodded. "Infinite care with the hammer, however much you wanted to smash whatever lay within reach." "Then do it. But Master Bulwer, you've been trying to guide me to this since Solanda left us. From now on, if you have a suggestion to make it." Even if I say no to 9 in a row, I'll always listen to a 10th. I'm not a clever man, but I'm willing to listen to people who are, and I think you are. Just don't try poking me in the direction you want me to go. I don't like that, Master Bulwer." Bulwer blinked, then of all things, bowed with his hands folded at his waist. He smelled surprised and gratified. Gratified? "As you say, my lord, my previous employer disliked me suggesting actions unless I was asked. I won't make the same mistake again, I assure you." Eyeing Perrin, he seemed to reach a decision. "If I may say so," he said carefully, "I have found serving you pleasant in ways I did not expect. You are what you seem, my lord, with no poisoned needles hidden away to catch the unwary. My previous employer was known widely for cleverness, but I believe you are equally clever in a different way. I believe I would regret leaving your service. Any man might say these things to keep his place, but I mean them." Poisoned needles? Before entering Perrin's service, Bulwer's last employment had been as secretary to a Mirandian noblewoman, fallen into hard times, who could no longer afford to keep him. Mirandi must be a rougher place than Perrin thought. "I see no reason for you to leave my employ. Just tell me what you want to do and let me decide. Don't try to prod. And forget the flattery." "I never flatter, my lord, but I am adept at shaping myself to my master's needs. It is a requirement of my profession." The little man bowed once more. He had never been this formal before. "If you have no further questions, my lord, may I go to find the Lady Midori?" Perrin nodded. The little man bowed yet again, backing away, then went skittering toward the camp, his cloak fluttering behind him as he dodged through the sharpened stakes, like a sparrow hopping across the snow. He was a strange fellow. "I don't trust him," Aram muttered, staring after Bulwer. "And I don't trust Solanda and that lot. They'll throw in with the Aes Sedai, you mark my words." "You have to trust somebody," Perrin said roughly. The question was, who? Swinging into Stepper's saddle, he booted the dun in the ribs. A hammer was useless, lying at rest. Chapter 6. The Scent of a Dream. The cold air seemed clean and fresh in Perrin's nose as he galloped into the forest, the breezes full of the crispness of the snow that fountained in sprays beneath Stepper's hooves. Out here he could forget old friends who were willing to believe the worst on rumor. He could try to forget Massima and the Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones. The Shaida were welded to the inside of his skull, however, an iron puzzle that would not yield no matter how he twisted. He wanted to wrench it apart, but that never worked with a blacksmith's puzzle. After one short burst of speed, he slowed the dun to a walk, feeling a touch of guilt. The darkness beneath the forest canopy was deep, and stone outcrops between the tall trees warned of more hidden beneath the snow, 100 places that might break a running horse's leg, and that without counting gopher holes and fox dens and badger sets. There was no need to take the risk. A gallop would not free Fail an hour sooner, and no horse could maintain that pace for long in any case. The snow here was knee-deep in places where it had drifted, and deep enough elsewhere. He rode northeast, though. The scouts would be coming from the northeast, with news of Fail. News of the Shido, at least a location. He had hoped for that so often, prayed for it, but today he knew it would come. Yet knowing only increased his anxiety. Finding them was only the first part of solving this puzzle. Anger made his mind flash from one thing to another, yet no matter what Bulwer said, Perrin knew he was methodical at best. He did not do well trying to think quickly, and lacking cleverness, methodical was going to have to do. Somehow. Aram caught up to him, running his gray hard, and slowed to ride just a little behind him to one side like a heeling hound. Perrin led him. Aram never smelled comfortable when Perrin made him ride alongside. The one time Tinker did not speak, but eddies in the icy air brought his scent, a melange of anger and suspicion and disgruntlement. He sat his saddle as tense as an overwound clock spring and watched the forest around him grimly, as though he expected Shido to leap out from behind the nearest tree. In truth, almost anything could have hidden from most men in these woods. Where the sky overhead could be seen through the canopy of branches, it held a definite tinge of dark grayness, but for the moment, That cast the forest in shadows murkier than night, and the trees themselves were massive columns of darkness. Yet even the shift of a black-winged jackdaw on a snow-mounted branch, its feathers fluffed against the cold, caught Perrin's eyes, and a hunting pine marten, a deeper black than the darkness, cautiously raising its head on another. He caught the scent of both, too. A faint whiff of man scent came from up in a massive oak with dark spreading limbs as thick as a pony. The Gildanan and Mayanners had their mounted patrols circling the camp a few miles out, but he preferred to rely on 2 Rivers men closer in. He did not have enough men to ring the camp completely, yet they were used to forests and to hunting animals that might hunt them in turn, used to noticing movement that would escape a man thinking in terms of soldiers in war. Ridge cats down from the mountains after sheep could hide in plain sight, and bear and wild boar were known to double back on their pursuers and lie in ambush. From branches 30 and 40 feet above the ground, the men could see anything that moved below in time to warn the camp, and with their longbows they could exact a heavy price from anyone who tried to force a way past them. Yet the presence of the guard touched his mind as lightly as the presence of the jackdaw. He was focused ahead through the trees and the shadows, intent on picking out the first sign of the scouts returning. Abruptly, Stepper tossed his head and snorted in a spew of mist, eyes rolling in fear as he stopped dead, and arms gray squealed and shied. Perrin leaned forward to pat the trembling stallion's neck, but his hand froze as he caught a trace of scent, a smell of burnt sulfur faint in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck try to stand. Almost burnt sulfur. That was only a pale imitation of this smell. It had a reek of wrongness, of something that did not belong in this world. The scent was not new. You could not ever have called that stink fresh, but not old either. An hour, perhaps less. Maybe about the time he had wakened, about the time he had dreamed of this scent. "What is it, Lord Perrin?" Aram was having difficulty controlling his gray, which danced in circles fighting the reins and wanted to run in any direction so long as it was away. But even while sawing at his reins, he had his wolf-head pummeled sword out. He practiced with it daily, for hours on end when he could. Those who knew about such things said he was good. "You may be able to make out a black thread from a white in this, but it isn't day yet to me. I can't see anything well enough to matter." "Put that away," Perrin told him. "It isn't needed. Swords wouldn't do any good anyway." He had to coax his trembling mount to move forward, but he followed the rank smell, scanning the snow-covered ground ahead. He knew that smell, and not just from the dream. It only took a little while to find what he was looking for, and Stepper gave a grateful whicker when Perrin reined him in well short of a slab-like crest of gray stone 2 paces wide that jutted up to his right. The snow all around was smooth and unmarked, but dog tracks covered the tilted span of stone, as though a pack had scrambled over it as they ran. Dimness and shadows or no, they were plain to Perrin's eyes. Footprints larger than the palm of his hand, pressed into the stone as though it had been mud. He patted Stepper's neck again. No wonder the animal was frightened. "Go back to the camp and find Daniel Aram. Tell him I said to let everyone know there were dark hounds here, maybe an hour ago. And put your sword away. You wouldn't want to try killing a dark hound with a sword, believe me." "Dark hounds?" Aram exclaimed, peering around into the murky shadows between the trees. There was an anxious fear in his scent now. Most men would have laughed about travelers' tales or stories for children. Tinkers roamed the countryside and knew it could be found in the wilds. Aram sheathed the sword on his back with obvious reluctance, but his right hand remained raised, half reaching for the hilt. "How do you kill a dark hound? Can they be killed?" Then again, maybe he did not have much good sense at that. "Just be glad you don't have to try, Aram. Now go do like I told you. Everyone needs to keep a sharp lookout in case they come back. Not much chance of that, I'd say, but better safe." Perrin remembered facing a pack of them once and killing one. He thought he had killed one after hitting it with 3 good broadhead arrows. Shadowspawn did not die easily. Moraine had had to finish that pack with balefire. "Make sure the Aes Sedai and Wise Ones learn of this, and the Ashaman." Small chance any of them knew how to make balefire. The women might not admit knowing of forbidden weed if they did, and maybe not the men either. But maybe they knew something else that could work. Aram was reluctant to leave Perrin alone until Perrin snapped at him, and then he turned back toward the camp, trailing smells of umbrage and hurt, as if 2 men would have been a whit safer than one. As soon as the other man was out of sight, Perrin reined Stepper southward, the direction the dark hounds had been heading. He did not want company for this, even arms. Just because people sometimes noted his sharp eyesight was no reason to flaunt it, or his sense of smell. There were already reasons enough to shun him without adding more. It might have been chance that the creatures had passed so near his camp, but the last few years had made him uneasy with coincidences. All too often, they were not coincidence at all, not the way other men counted such things. If this was another bit of his Taviran tugging at the pattern, it was a bit he could have done without. The thing seemed to have more disadvantages than advantages, even when it appeared to be working in your favor. The chance that favored you one minute could turn on you in the next. And there was always another possibility. Being Taviran made you stand out in the pattern, and some of the Forsaken could use that to find you at times. Or so he had been told. Maybe some shadow spawn could, too. The trail he followed was surely near an hour old, but Perrin felt a tightness between his shoulder blades, a prickling on his scalp. The sky was still a deep dark gray where it showed, even to his eyes. The sun had not yet crested the horizon. Just before sunrise was one of the worst times to meet the wild hunt, when darkness was changing to light, but the light had not taken hold. At least there was no crossroads nearby, no graveyard, but the only hearthstones to touch lay back in Brighton, and he was not certain how much safety those hovels held. In his mind, he marked out the location of a nearby stream, where the camp got its water by chopping through the ice. It was no more than 10 or 12 paces wide and only knee-deep, but putting running water between you and dark hounds would stop them, supposedly. But then, so would facing them, supposedly, and he had seen the results of that. His nose tested the breezes, searching for that old scent, and for any hint of a newer. Coming on these things unaware would be worse than unpleasant. Stepper caught scents almost as easily as Perrin, and sometimes noticed what they were sooner. But whenever the dun balked, Perrin forced him forward. There were plenty of tracks scattered in the snow, hoofprints of the mounted patrols going out and coming back, occasional sign of rabbits and foxes. But the only marks left by the dark hounds were where stones stuck up out of the snow. The burnt sulfur smell was always strongest there, yet enough trace lingered in between to lead him to the next place where their tracks showed. The huge paw prints overlapped one another, and there was no way to tell how many dark hounds there had been. But whether a pace wide or 6, every rock surface they had crossed was smothered in tracks from one side to the other. Larger pack than the 10 he had seen outside Ilion. Much larger. Was that why there were no wolves in the area? He was sure that the certainty of death he had felt in the dream was something real, and he had been a wolf in the dream. As the trail began to curve to the west, he felt a growing suspicion that firmed into certainty as it continued to bend. The dark hounds had circled the camp completely, running right across the place north of the camp where several huge trees lay half-toppled and propped by their neighbors, each with a tall chunk sliced cleanly out of its splintered trunk. The tracks covered a stone outcrop as smooth and flat as a polished marble floor, except for one hair-thin gouge cut through it straight as a plumb line. Nothing resisted the opening of an Ashaman's gateway, and 2 had opened here. A thick pine that had fallen blocking one had a section 4 paces wide burned out of it, but the charred ends were as neat as if they had come from a sawmill. It seemed that evidence of the one power did not interest dark hounds, however. The pack had not paused there any more than anywhere else, or even slowed that he could tell. Dark hounds could run faster than horses, and for longer, and the stench of them hardly seemed to have faded more in one place than another. At 2 points in that circuit, he had picked up a forking in the trail, but that was only the pack coming from the north and departing south. Once around the camp, and then on their way after whatever or whoever they were hunting. Plainly, that was not him. Perhaps the pack had circled because they sensed him, sensed someone who was Taviran, yet he doubted that dark hounds would have hesitated one instant coming into the camp had they been after him. The pack he had faced before had entered the city of Ilion, though it had not tried to kill him till later. But did dark hounds report what they saw the way rats and ravens did? The thought made his jaw clench. The Shadow's attention was something any sane man feared. The Shadow's attention might interfere with freeing Fail. That concerned him more than anything else. Yet there were ways to fight Shadow Spawn, ways to fight the Forsaken if it came to that. Whatever came between him and Fail, dark hounds or the Forsaken or anything else, he would find a way to go around or through, whichever was necessary. A man could only have so much fear in him at one time. and all of his fear was centered on Fail. There just was no room for any more. Before he reached his starting place again, the breezes brought in the smells of people and horses, sharp in the icy cold. He ranged Stepper to a slow walk, and then to a halt. He had spotted some 50 or 60 horses, near 100 paces ahead. The sun had finally peaked above the horizon and begun to send sharply slanted shafts of light through the forest canopy, reflecting off the snow and lessening the gloom a little, though deep dappled shadows remained between the sun's slender fingers. Some of those shadows enveloped him. The mounted party was not far from where he had first seen the dark hound's tracks, and he could see Arm's sickly green cloak and red-striped coat, the tinker garments jarring with the sword on his back. Most of the riders wore red-rimmed helmets shaped like pots, and dark cloaks over red breastplates, and the long red streamers on their lances stirred in the light airs as the soldiers tried to keep watch in every direction. The 1st of May often rode out in the mornings with a suitable bodyguard of the winged guards. He started to slip away without having to meet Berlane, but then he saw 3 tall women afoot among the horses, long dark shawls wrapped around their heads and draped over their upper bodies. They hesitated. Wise ones rode when they had to, if unwillingly, but tramping a mile or 2 in the snow, wearing heavy woolen skirts, was insufficient reason to force them onto horseback. Almost certainly, Sionid or Masuria was in that group as well, though the Aiu women seemed to like Berlane for some reason he could not fathom. He had no thought of joining the riders, no matter who was with them, but hesitation cost him his chance at evasion. One of the wise ones, he thought it was Corel, a fire-haired woman, who always had a challenge in her sharp blue eyes, raised a hand to point in his direction, and the whole party turned, the soldiers whipping their horses around and peering through the trees toward him, lances tipped with a foot of steel half lowered. It was unlikely they could make him out clearly through the deep pools of shadow and bright bars of sunlight. He was surprised the wise one had, but then Aiel generally had sharp eyes. Missouri was there, a slim woman in a bronze-colored cloak, riding a dapple mare, and Anura as well, keeping her brown mare well back, but marked by the dozens of thin, dark braids that hung from the opening of her cowl. Berlane herself sat a sleek bay gelding at the forefront, a tall, beautiful young woman with long black hair and a red cloak lined with black fur. A simple flaw lessened her beauty, though. She was not Fail. A worse flaw ruined it, as far as he was concerned. He had learned of Fail's kidnapping from her, and of Masima's contact with the Shonchan, but nearly everyone in the camp believed that he had slept with Berlane on the very night Fail was taken, and she had done nothing to correct the tale. It was hardly the kind of story he could ask her to stand up and deny publicly, yet she could have said something, told her maids to deny it, anything. Instead, Berlane held her silence, and her maids, gossiping like magpies, actually fostered the tale. That sort of reputation stuck to a man in the 2 rivers. He had avoided Berlane since that night, and he would have ridden away now, even after they saw him. But she took a hoop-handled basket from the maid accompanying her, a plump woman wrapped in a blue and gold cloak, then spoke to the others and started her sleek bay gelding toward him. Alone. Anura raised a hand and called something after her, but Berlane never glanced back. Perrin did not doubt she would follow wherever he went, and the way things were, leaving would only make people believe he wanted to be private with her. He dug his heels into Stepper's flanks, meaning to join the others no matter how little he wanted to, let her follow him back to them if she wanted. But she urged the bay to a canter, despite the rough ground and the snow, even leaping a stone outcrop, her red cloak flowing out behind her, and met him halfway. She was a good rider, he admitted grudgingly. Not as good as Fail, but better than most. Your scowl is quite fierce, she laughed softly as she halted right in front of Stepper. From the way she held her reins, she was ready to block him if he tried going around. The woman had no shame at all. Smile, so people think we are flirting. She pushed the basket at him with one crimson-gloved hand. This should make you smile, at least. I hear you forget to eat. Her nose wrinkled. And to wash, it seems. Your beard needs trimming, too. A careworn, somewhat disheveled husband rescuing his wife is a romantic figure. But she might not think so well of a dirty ragamuffin. No woman will ever forgive you, ruining her image of you. Suddenly confused, Perrin took the basket, sitting it in front of him on the tall pommel of his saddle, and unconsciously rubbed at his nose. He was accustomed to certain smells from Barreling, usually those of a hunting she-wolf, and he was the intended prey. But today she gave off no hunting scent, not a whisper of it. She smelled patient as stone and amused, with undercurrents of fear. The woman certainly had never been afraid of him that he recalled. And what did she have to be patient about? For that matter, what did she have to be amused about? A ridge cat smelling like a lamb would not have confounded him more. Confusion or no, his stomach rumbled at the aromas drifting from the lidded basket. Roasted wood hen, unless he was much mistaken, and bread still warm from the baking. Flour was in short supply, and bread almost as rare as meat. It was true that he missed eating some days. He really did forget sometimes. When he remembered, eating was a chore, for he had to run the gauntlet of Linny and Brianna, or be given the cold shoulder by people he had grown up with just to get a meal. Food right under his nose made his mouth water. Would it be disloyal to eat food brought by Barreling? "Thank you for the loaf and the wood hen," he said roughly. "But the last thing on earth I want is for anyone to think we're flirting. And I wash when I can, if it's any of your business. It isn't easy in this weather. Besides, nobody else smells any better than I do." She did, he realized suddenly. There was no hint of sweat or dirt under her light, flowery perfume. It irritated him that he had noticed she was wearing perfume, or that she smelled clean. It seemed a betrayal. Barrelane's eyes widened momentarily in startlement. Why? But then she sighed through her smile, which was beginning to look fixed, and a thread of irritation entered her scent. "Have your tent set up. I know there's a good copper bathtub in one of your carts. You won't have thrown that out. People expect a noble to look like a noble parent, and that includes being presentable, even when it takes extra effort. It's a bargain between you and them. You must give them what they expect as well as what they need or want, or they lose respect and start resenting you for making them lose it. Frankly, none of us can afford for you to let that happen. We're all far from our homes, surrounded by enemies, and I very much believe that you, Lord Perrin Golden Eyes, may be our only chance of living to reach our homes again. Without you, everything falls apart. Now smile, because if we're flirting, then we aren't talking about something else." Perrin bared his teeth. The Mayanners and the Wise Ones were watching, but at 50 paces in this gloom it would be taken for a smile. Lose respect? Barrelane had helped strip him of any respect he once had from the Two Rivers folk, not to mention Fail's servants. Worse, Fail had given him some version of that lecture about a noble's duty to give people what they expected more than once. What he resented was hearing this woman, of all people, echo his wife. "What are we talking about, then, that you don't trust your own people to know?" Her face remained smooth and smiling, but the undercurrent of fear in her sense strengthened. It was nowhere near panic, but she believed herself in danger. Her gloved hands were tight on the bay's reins. "I've had my thief catchers nosing about in Nosima's camp, making friends. Not as good as having eyes and ears there, but they took wine they supposedly stole from me, and they learned a little by listening." For an instant she regarded him quizzically, tilting her head. Right. She knew Fail used Solanda and those other idiots as spies. It had been Barrelane who told him about them in the first place. Likely Gendar and Santes, her thief catchers, had seen Javiera and Nerion in Nosima's camp. Bulwer would have to be warned before he tried to set Midori on Barrelane and Anura. That would certainly make a fine tangle. When he said nothing, she went on. "I put something in that basket besides bread and a wood hen. A document that Santos found earlier yesterday, locked away in Nosima's camp desk. The fool never saw a lock without wanting to know what it hid. If he had to meddle with what Nosima kept under lock and key, he should have memorized the thing instead of taking it. But what's done is done. Don't let anyone see you reading it after I went to all this trouble to hide it," she added sharply as he lifted the basket's lid, revealing a cloth-wrapped bundle and releasing stronger smells of roasted bird and warm bread. "I've seen Nosima's men following you before. They could be watching now." "I'm not a fool," he growled. He knew about Nosima's watchers. Most of the man's followers were townsmen, and most of the rest awkward enough in the woods to shame a 10-year-old back home. which was not to say one or two might not be hiding somewhere among the trees close enough to spy from among the shadows. They always kept their distance, since his eyes made them believe he was some sort of half-tame shadow spawn, so he seldom detected their scents. And he had had other things on his mind this morning. Fingering the cloth aside to expose the wood hen, almost as large as a fair-sized chicken, with its skin crisply browned, he tore off one of the bird's legs while feeling under the bundle, and sliding out a piece of heavy cream-colored paper folded in four. Careless of grease spots, he unfolded the paper atop the bird, a little clumsily in his gauntlets, and read while nibbling on the leg. To everyone watching, he would appear to be studying what part of the wood hen to attack next. A thick green wax seal, cracked on one side, held an impression of what he decided were three hands, each with the forefinger and little finger raised, and the others folded. The letters written on the paper in a flowing script were oddly formed, some unrecognizable, but the thing was readable with a little effort. The bearer of this stands under my personal protection. In the name of the Empress, may she live forever, give him whatever aid he requires in service to the Empire, and speak of it to no one but me. By her seal, Surath Sabel Madarth, Vasanvairan Varsava, High Lady. The Empress, he said softly, soft like iron brushing silk. Confirmation of Massima's dealings with the Shonchan, though for himself he had needed none. It was not the sort of thing Berlane would have lied about. Surath Sabel Meldareth must be someone important to be handing out this kind of document. This will finish him, once Santes testified where he found it. Service to the Empire. Massima knew Rand had fought the Shonchan. That rainbow burst into his head and was swept away. The man was a traitor. Berlane laughed as if he had said something witty, but her smile definitely looked forced now. Santes told me no one saw him in the bustle of setting up camp, so I allowed him and Gendar to go back with my last cask of good Tanagan. They were supposed to return by an hour after dark, but neither has. I suppose they could be sleeping it off, but they've never... She broke off with a startled sound, staring at him, and he realized that he had bitten the thigh bone in half. Like he had stripped all the flesh from the leg without noticing. I'm hungrier than I thought, he muttered. Spitting the nubbled bone into the palm of his gauntlet, he dropped the pieces to the ground. It's safe to assume Massima knows you have this. I hope you're keeping a heavy guard around you all the time, not just when you ride out. Galen has 50 men sleeping around my tent as of last night, she said, still staring, and he sighed. You would think she had never seen anybody bite a bone in two before. What has Anura told you? She wanted me to give it to her to destroy, so if I was asked, I could say I didn't have it, and didn't know where it was, and she could support my word. I doubt that would satisfy Massima, though. No, I doubt it would. Anura had to know that, too. I said I could be wrong-headed, or even foolish upon occasion, but they were never stupid. Did she say she would destroy it, or that if you gave it to her, she could? Berlane's brow furrowed in thought, and it took her a moment to say that she would. The bay danced a few impatient steps, but she brought him under control easily without paying attention. I can't think what else she would want it for, she said after another pause. Massima is hardly likely to be susceptible to pressure. Blackmail, she meant. Baron could not see Massima standing still for that either, especially blackmail by an Aes Sedai. Under cover of tearing the other leg loose from the bird, he managed to refold the piece of paper and tuck it into his sleeve where his gauntlet would keep it from falling out. It was still evidence. But of what? How could the man be both a fanatic for the Dragon Reborn and a traitor? Could he have taken the document from... who? Some collaborator he had captured? But why would Massima keep it locked away, unless it had been meant for him? He had met with Shonchan. And how had he intended to use it? Who could tell what a thing this would allow a man to call on? Baron sighed heavily. He had too many questions and no answers. Answers required a quicker mind than his. Maybe Bulwer would have a notion. With a taste of food in it, his stomach wanted him to devour the leg in his hand and the rest of the bird too, but he closed the lid firmly and tried to take measured bites. There was one thing he could find out for himself. What else has Anura said about Massima? Nothing, besides that he's dangerous and I should avoid him, as if I didn't know that already. She dislikes him and talking about him. Another brief hesitation, and Berlin added, Why? The first of Mayenne was used to intrigues, and she listened for what was not said. Perrin took another bite to give himself a moment while he chewed and swallowed. He was not used to intrigues, yet he had been exposed to enough of them to know that saying too much could be dangerous. So could saying too little, no matter what Bulwer thought. Anura has been meeting with Massima in secret. So has Masuri. Berelane's fixed smile remained in place, but alarm entered her scent. She started to twist in her saddle as if to look back at the two Aes Sedai, and stopped herself, licking her lips with the tip of her tongue. Aes Sedai always have their reasons, was all she said. So was she alarmed over her advisor meeting Massima, or alarmed that Perrin knew, or... He hated all these complications. They just got in the way of what was important. Like he had managed to clean the second leg already. Hoping Berelain had not noticed, he hastily tossed the bones aside. His belly growled for more. Her people had maintained their distance, but Aram had ridden a short way toward Perrin and Berelain, and was leaning forward to peer at them through the shadowed trees. The wise ones were standing to one side talking among themselves, seemingly unaware that they were over their ankles in snow, or that the cold breezes had picked up enough to flap the dangling ends of their shawls. Every so often, one or another of the three looked Perrin and Berelain's way too. Notions of privacy never kept a wise one from sticking her nose wherever she wanted. They were like Aes Sedai that way. Masuri and Anura were watching too, though they appeared to be keeping their distance from one another. Perrin would have wagered that without the wise ones there, both sisters would have been using the one power to eavesdrop. Of course, the wise ones probably knew how to do that too, and they had allowed Masuri's visits to Massima. Would either Aes Sedai crack her teeth if they saw the wise ones listening with the power? Anura seemed almost as careful with the wise ones as Masuri was. Like he had no time for this briar thicket. He had to live in it, though. We've given tongues enough to wag over, he said. Not that they needed any more than they had. Hooking the basket's hoop handles over his pommel, he heeled Stepper's flanks. It could hardly be disloyal just to eat a bird. Berelain did not follow immediately, yet before he reached Aram, she caught up and slowed her bay beside him. I'll find out what Anura is up to, she said determinedly, looking straight ahead. Her eyes were hard. Perrin would have pitied Anura if he had not been ready to try shaking answers out of her himself. But then, Aes Sedai seldom needed pity, and they seldom gave answers they did not want to give. The next instant, Berelain was all smiles and gaiety again, though the scent of determination still hung about her, almost crushing the fear scent. Young Aram has been telling us all about Heartsbane riding these woods with the wild hunt boat parrot. Could it really be so, do you think? I remember hearing those tales in the nursery. Her voice was light and amused and carrying. Aram's cheeks turned red, and some of the men beyond him laughed. They stopped laughing, and Perrin showed them the tracks in the stone slab. Chapter 7. Blacksmith's Puzzle. When the laughter cut off, Aram put on a smug grin, and with none of the fear scent he had given off earlier. Anyone would have thought he had already seen the tracks himself, and knew everything there was to know. No one paid any mind to his smirk, however, or much of anything except the huge dog tracks impressed in stone. Even Perrin's explanation that the dark hounds were long gone. Of course, he could not tell them how he knew that, yet no one seemed to notice the lack. One of the sharply slanting bars of early morning light was falling directly on the gray slab, illuminating it clearly. Stepper had grown accustomed to the fading burnt sulfur smell. At least he only snorted and laid back his ears, but the other horses shied at the tilted stone. None of the humans except Perrin could detect that smell, and most growled over their mounts' fractious behavior, and peered at the oddly marked stone as if it were a curiosity displayed by a traveling show. Berelain's plump maid screamed when she saw the tracks, and swayed on the point of falling off her round-bellied, nervously dancing mare, but Berelain merely asked Anura in an absent fashion to look after her, and stared at the prince with as little expression as if she herself were Aes Sedai. Her hands tightened on her reins, though, until the thin red leather paled across her knuckles. Pt.11, the Lord Captain of the Winged Guards, his red helmet embossed with wings and bearing 3 thin crimson plumes, had personal command of Berelain's bodyguard this morning, and he forced his tall black gelding close to the stone, swinging down from his saddle in knee-deep snow and removing his helmet, to frown at the stone slab with his one eye. A scarlet leather patch covered the empty socket of the other, the strap cutting through his shoulder-length gray hair. His grimace said he saw trouble, but he always saw the worst possibilities first. Perrin supposed that was better in a soldier than always seeing the best. Missouri dismounted too, but no sooner was she on the ground than she paused with her dapple's reins in one gloved hand, looking uncertainly toward the three sun-dark Aiel women. A few of the Mayaner soldiers muttered uneasily at that, yet they should have been used to it by now. Anura hid her face deeper in her gray hood as if she did not want to see the rock, and gave Bereline's maid a brisk shake. The woman goggled at her in astonishment. Missouri, on the other hand, waited beside her man with an appearance of patience, spoiled only by smoothing the russet skirts of her silk riding dress, as though unaware of what she was doing. The wise ones exchanged silent glances, expressionless as sisters themselves. Carell stood on one side of Navarin, a skinny green-eyed woman, and on the other, Marlene, with eyes of twilight blue and dark hair, rare among Aiel, not covered completely with her shawl. All three were tall women, as tall as some men, and none looked more than a few years older than Perrin, but no one could have managed that calm self-assurance without more years than their faces claimed. Despite the long necklaces and heavy bracelets of gold and ivory that they wore, their dark heavy skirts and the dark shawls that almost hid their white blouses could have suited farm women. Yet there was no doubt who was in command between them and the Aes Sedai. In truth, sometimes there seemed to be doubts who was in command between them and Perrin. Finally, Navarin nodded, and gave a warm and approving smile. Perrin had never before seen a smile out of her. Navarin did not walk around scowling, but she usually seemed to be searching for someone to upbraid. Not until that nod did Missouri hand her reins up to one of the soldiers. Her warder was nowhere to be seen, and that had to be the wise one's doing. Robert usually stuck to her like a burr. Lifting her divided skirts, she waded through the snow, deeper the closer to the stone she came, and began passing her hands above the footprints, obviously channeling, though nothing happened that Perrin could see. The wise ones watched her closely, but then Missouri's weaves were visible to them. Anura displayed no interest. The ends of the Grey Sister's narrow braids twitched as if she were shaking her head inside her hood. She moved her horse back from the maid, well out of the wise one's line of sight, but that took her farther from Berelain, who anyone could think might want her advice now. Anura really did avoid the wise ones as much as she could. "Fireside stories walking," Galen muttered, drawing his gelding away from the stone with a sideways glance at Missouri. Aes Sedai he honored, yet few men wanted to be close to an Aes Sedai who was channeling. "Though I don't know why I'm surprised anymore after what I've seen since leaving Mariam." Intent on the tracks, Missouri did not seem to notice him. A stir rippled through the mounted lancers, as though they had not really believed their own eyes until their commander gave confirmation. And some of them began to smell of uneasy fear, as if expecting dark hounds to leap out of the shadows. Perrin could not pick out individuals among so many with any ease, but the jittery rankness was strong enough that it had to come from more than a few. Galen seemed to sense what Perrin smelled. He had his faults, but he had commanded soldiers for a long time. Hanging his helmet on his longsword hilt, he grinned. The eye patch gave it a grim quality, a man who could see a joke in the face of death and expected others to see it too. "If the black dogs bother us, we'll salt their ears," he announced in a loud and hearty voice. "That's what you do in the stories, isn't it? Sprinkle salt in their ears and they vanish." A few of the lancers laughed, though the miasma of fear did not lessen appreciably. Stories told by the fire were one thing, those same stories walking in the flesh quite another. Galen led his black to Berelain, and rested the gauntleted hand on her bay's neck. He gave Perrin a considering look that Perrin returned levelly, refusing to take the hint. Whatever the man had to say, he could say in front of him and Aram. Galen sighed. "They will keep their nerve, milady," he said softly. "But the fact is, our position is precarious, with enemies on every side and our supplies running out. Shadowspawn can only make matters worse. My duty is to you and Mayenne, milady, and with all respect to Lord Perrin, you may wish to alter your plans." Anger crackled in Perrin. The man would abandon Fahil? But Berelain spoke before he could suggest it. "There will be no alteration, Lord Galen." Sometimes it was easy to forget that she was a ruler, small though Mayenne was, but there was a regal tone in her voice, fit for the Queen of Andor. Back straight, she made her saddle seem a throne, and she spoke loudly enough to make sure everyone heard her decision, firmly enough that everyone knew the decision had been made. If we have enemies all around, then going on is as safe as turning back or turning aside. Yet if turning back or turning aside were 10 times safer, I would still go on. I intend to see the Lady Fael rescued if we must fight our way through 1,000 dark hounds and Trollocs as well. That I have sworn to do. A roar of cheers answered her, winged guards shouting and thrusting their lances into the air, so the red streamers danced. The smell of fear remained, but they sounded ready to cut their way through any number of Trollocs, rather than appear less in Berlane's eyes. Galen commanded them, but they felt more than fondness for their ruler, despite her reputation with men. Maybe because of it, in part. Berlane had kept Tyr from swallowing Mayenne by playing one man who found her beautiful against another. For his part, Perrin found it hard not to gape in surprise. She sounded as determined as he was. She smelled as determined. Galen bowed his gray head in unwilling acceptance. Berlane gave a small, satisfied nod before turning her attention to the Aes Sedai beside the stone slab. Musuri had stopped waving her hands about and was staring at the footprints, tapping a finger against her lips thoughtfully. She was a pretty woman without being beautiful, though some of that might have been Aes Sedai agelessness, with a grace and elegance that might also have come from being Aes Sedai. It was often difficult to tell a sister who had been born on a hardscrabble farm from one born in a grand palace. Perrin had seen her red-faced and angry, worn down and on the end of her tether. Yet despite hard travel and life in the Aiel tents, her dark hair and her clothing looked as though she had a maid attending her, too. She might have been standing in a library. "What have you learned, Musuri?" Berlane asked. "Musuri, if you please." "Musuri!" The last came a little more shortly, and Musuri gave a start, as though surprised to realize she was not alone. Possibly she was startled. In many ways, she seemed more the green Arja than the brown, more intent on action than on contemplation. Straight to the point and never vague. Yet she was still capable of losing herself completely in whatever captured her interest. Pulling her hands at her waist, she opened her mouth, but rather than speaking, she hesitated, and looked a question at the wise ones. "Go on, girl," Navarre said impatiently, landing her fists on her hips in a jangle of bracelets. A frown made her appear more her usual self, but neither of the other wise ones looked any more approving. 3 frowns in a row, like 3 pale-eyed crows on a fence. "We were not simply letting you exercise your curiosity. Get on with it. Tell us what you learned." Musuri's face reddened, but she spoke up immediately, her eyes on Berlane. She could not like being called down in public, no matter what anyone knew of her relationship with the wise ones. "Relatively little is known of dark hounds, but I've made something of a study of them in a small way. Over the years, I've crossed the paths of 7 packs, 5 of them twice, and 2 others 3 times. The color began to fade from her cheeks, and slowly she began to sound as if she were lecturing. Some ancient writers say there are only 7 packs. Others say 9 or 13, or some other number they believed had special significance. But during the Trolloc Wars, Sorolana Alsahan wrote of the 100 packs of the Shadow's hounds that hunt the night. And even earlier, Ivanel Baraktia supposedly wrote of hounds born of the Shadow, in numbers like unto the nightmares of mankind. Though in truth, Ivanel herself may be apocryphal. In any case, she gestured as if groping for a word. Smell is not the right word, and neither is flavor. The sense of each pack is unique, and I can say with certainty that I have never encountered this one before, so we know the number 7 is wrong. Whether the correct number is 9 or 13 or something else, tales of dark hounds are much more common than dark hounds themselves, and they are extremely rare this far south of the Blight. A second rarity, there may have been as many as 50 in this pack. 10 or 12 is the usual limit. A useful maxim, 2 rarities combined call for close attention. Pausing, she raised a finger to emphasize the point, then nodded when she thought Berlane had taken it, and folded her hands again. A gusting breeze pushed her yellowish-brown cloak off one shoulder, yet she did not appear to notice the loss of warmth. There is always a feel of urgency about Darkhound's trails, but it varies according to a number of factors, not all of which I can be certain of. This one has an intense admixture of, I suppose you could call it impatience. That isn't really strong enough by far. As well call a stab wound a pinprick, but it will do. I would say their hunt has been going on for some time, and their prey is eluding them somehow. No matter what the stories say, by the way, Lord Gallen, salt doesn't harm darkhounds in the least, so she had not been entirely lost in thought after all. Despite the stories, they never hunt at random, though they will kill if the opportunity presents itself and doesn't interfere with the hunt. With darkhounds, the hunt is paramount. Their quarry is always important to the shadow, though at times we cannot see why. They have been known to bypass the great and mighty to slay a farm wife or a craftsman, or to enter a town or village and leave without killing, though clearly they came for some reason. My first thought for what brought them here had to be discarded since they moved on. Her gaze flickered toward Perrin, so quickly he was not sure anyone else noticed. Given that, I strongly doubt they will return. Oh yes, and they are an hour or more gone. That, I'm afraid, is really all I can tell you. Navarre and the other wise ones nodded their approval as she finished, and a touch of color returned to her cheeks, though it vanished quickly as she assumed the mask of Aes Sedai serenity. A shift in the breeze brought her scent to Perrin, surprised and pleased, and upset at being pleased. Thank you, Monsieur Sedai, Berlin said formally, making a small bow in her saddle that Missouri acknowledged with a slight motion of her head. You have put our minds at rest. Indeed, the fear smell among the soldiers began to fade, though Perrin heard Gallen rumble under his breath. She might have told those last bits first. Perrin's ears caught something else, too, with the stamping of horses' hooves and men's quiet, relieved laughter. A blue tit's trill sounded to the south, beyond the hearing of anyone else there, followed closely by the buzzing call of a masked sparrow. Another blue tit sounded, closer, followed again by a masked sparrow, and then the same pair called again, closer still. There might be blue tits and masked sparrows in Altara, but he knew these birds carried Two Rivers longbows. The blue tit meant men were coming, more than a few, and maybe unfriendly. The masked sparrow, that some back home called the thief bird for its habit of stealing bright objects, on the other hand. Perrin ran a thumb along the edge of his axe, but he waited for one more pair of calls, close enough that the others might have noticed. Did you hear that? He said, looking south as if he had just heard. My sentries have spotted Massima. That brought heads up, listening, and several men nodded when the calls were repeated, closer still. He's coming this way. Growling curses, Gallen clapped his helmet onto his head and mounted. Anura gathered her reins, and Missouri began floundering back toward her dapple. The lancers shifted in their saddles and began giving off smells of anger, once more touched with fear. The winged guards were owed a blood debt by Massima in their eyes, but none was anxious to try collecting with only 50 men, not when Massima always rode with 100 at his back. I will not run from him, Berlane announced. She stared south, wearing a cold frown. We will wait for him here. Gallen opened his mouth and closed it again without speaking, to her at least. Drawing a deep breath, he began to bellow orders arraying his guardsmen. This was not an easy matter. No matter how far apart the trees stood, forests were poor places for lancers. Any charge would be disjointed at its start, and sticking a man with a lance was difficult when he could dodge behind a tree trunk and come up behind you. Gallen tried to form them in front of Berlane, between her and the approaching men, but she gave him a sharp look, and the one-eyed man changed his commands, lining the lancers up in a single crooked rank, bulging around massive trees but centered on her. One soldier Gallen sent racing back toward the camp, crouching low in his saddle with his lance low as if at the charge, riding as fast as he could in spite of the snow and terrain. Berlane raised an eyebrow at that, yet said nothing. Anura began guiding her brown mare toward Berlane, but stopped when Missouri called her name. The brown sister had gathered her dapple, but still stood in the snow with the wise ones around her, who were tall enough in comparison to make her seem less than full grown. Anura hesitated until Missouri summoned her again, more sharply, and then Perrin thought he heard Anura sigh heavily before she rode to them and dismounted. Whatever the Aiel women had to say, in voices pitched too softly for Perrin to hear, clustering in front of Anura with heads bent close to hers, the Terabana sister did not like. Her face remained hidden in her hood, but her thin braids swung ever faster with the shaking of her head, and at last she turned away abruptly and put a foot in the stirrup of her saddle. Missouri had been standing quietly, letting the wise ones have their say, and now she laid a hand on Anura's sleeve and said something in a low voice that made Anura's shoulders slump, and the wise ones nod. Pushing back her hood to fall down her back, Anura waited for Missouri to climb onto her mare before mounting her own horse, and then the two sisters rode back to the line of lancers together, crowding in beside Berelain, with the wise ones pushing in between them, on the other side from Perrin. Anura's wide mouth was turned down in a glum curve, and she was rubbing her thumbs nervously. "What is it you're planning?" Perrin asked, trying not to hide suspicion. Maybe the wise ones had let Masuri meet with Masima, yet they still claimed to think the man was better dead. The Aes Sedai could not use the power as a weapon unless they were in danger, but the wise ones had no such prohibition. He wondered whether they were linked. He knew more than he wanted about the One Power, and enough about the wise ones to be sure that Navarre would be in control if they had formed a circle. Anura opened her mouth, but snapped it shut at a warning touch from Corell, and glared at Masuri. The brown sister pursed her lips and shook her head slightly, which did not seem to mollify Anura. Her gloved hands gripped the reins so tightly that they shook. Navarre looked up at Perrin past Berelain, as if she read his mind. "We plan to see you safely back to the camp, Perrin Ibarra," she said sharply. "You and Berelain, Perron. We plan to see that as many as possible survive this day and the days to come. Do you have objections?" "Just don't do anything unless I tell you," he said. An answer like that could mean a lot of things. "Not anything." Navarre shook her head in disgust, and Corell laughed as if he had made a huge joke. None of the wise ones seemed to think any more response was needed. They had been commanded to obey him, but their notions of obedience failed to square with any he had ever learned. Pigs would grow wings before he got a better answer out of them. He could have put a stop to it. He knew he should. No matter what the wise ones had planned, meeting Masima this far from the others in the camp, when the man had to know who had stolen his Shonchan paper, was like hoping to snatch her hand off the anvil before the hammer fell. Berelain was almost as bad as the wise ones when it came to following orders, but he thought she would listen if he gave an order to withdraw to the camp. He thought she would, but her smell said she had dug her heels in hard. Staying was a senseless risk. He was sure he could convince her of that. Yet he did not want to run from the man either. Part of him said he was being a fool. The larger part smoldered with anger that he found hard to control. Aram crowded in beside him, scowling, but at least he had not drawn his sword. Waving a sword might put a hot coal in the hayloft, and the time for a confrontation with Masima had not come yet. Perrin rested a hand on his axe. Not yet. Despite the sharply angled rays of light that penetrated through the thick branches overhead, the forest as a whole lay wrapped in dim early morning shadows. Even at noon, it would be dim. Sounds came to him first. The muffled thud of hooves in snow, the heavy breath of horses pushed for speed, and then a mass of riders appeared, a disordered mob flowing north among the huge trees at a near gallop in spite of snow and rough ground. Rather than 100, they numbered 2 or 3 times that. A horse went down with a scream, and lay thrashing atop its rider, but none of the others so much as slowed until, some 70 or 80 paces away, the man with their head raised a hand, and they suddenly drew rein in squares of snow, lathered horses blowing hard and steaming. Here and there, lances stuck up among the riders. Most wore no armor, and many just a breastplate or a helmet, yet their saddles were hung about with swords and axes and maces. Shafts of sunlight picked out a few faces, grim, flat-eyed men who looked as though they had never smiled and never would. It occurred to Perrin that he might have made a mistake not to overrule Berelain. That was what came of hasty decisions. Everyone knew that she often rode out in the mornings, and seemed mighty desperate to recover his Shonchan document. Even with the Aes Sedai and wise ones, a fight in these woods could turn bloody, a free-for-all where men and women could die without once seeing who killed them. If no witnesses lived, it could always be blamed on bandits or even the Shido. That had happened before. And if there were witnesses left, Masima was not above hanging a few dozen of his own men and claiming the guilty had been punished. He likely wanted to keep Perrin Ibarra alive for a while yet, though, and he would not have expected the wise ones or a second Aes Sedai. Small points to hang 50-odd lives on. Very small points to hang Fail's life on. Perrin eased his axe in its loop on his belt. Beside him, Berelain smelled of cool calm and stony determination. No fear, oddly. Not a whiff. Arm smelled excited. The two parties sat regarding one another in silence, until at last Masima rode forward, followed by just 2 men, all 3 pushing back their hoods. None wore a helmet or any piece of armor. Like Masima, Nengar of Artu were Shinaran, but unlike him, they had shaved off their top knots, leaving bare heads with a look of skulls. The coming of the Dragon Reborn had broken all bonds, including those that had pledged these men to fight the shadow along the blight. Nengar and Bartu each carried a sword on his back and had another hanging at his saddle bow, and Bartu, shorter than the other two, had a cased horse bow and a quiver fastened to his saddle too. Masima wore no visible weapons. The prophet of the Lord Dragon Reborn needed none. Perrin was glad to see Galen watching the men Masima had left behind, for there was something about Masima that drew the eye. Maybe it was only knowing who he was, but that was more than enough. Masima stopped his rangy sorrel a few paces from Perrin. The prophet was a dark, frowning man of average size, with a faded arrow scar white on his cheek. In a worn brown woolen coat and a dark cloak with frayed edges. Masima cared nothing for appearances, least of all his own. At his back, Nengar and Bartu held a fever in their eyes. Masima's deep-set, almost black eyes seemed as hot as coals in a forge, as though the breezes must soon fan them to a glow, and his smell was the jangled, darting sharpness of pure insanity. He ignored the wise ones in Aes Sedai with a scorn he did not bother to hide. Wise ones were worse than Aes Sedai, in his view. They not only blasphemed by channeling the One Power, they were Aiel savages to boot, a double sin. The winged guards could have been just more shadows beneath the trees. "You're taking a picnic," he said, with a glance at the basket hanging from Perrin's saddle. Normally, Masima's voice was as intense as his eyes, but now it sounded wry, and his lip curled as his eyes traveled to Berylane. He had heard the rumors, of course. A wave of rage shot through Perrin, but he seized onto it, forcing it back, pulling it in with the rest, holding it tight. His anger had one target, and he would not waste it striking at another. Catching his rider's mood, Stepper bared his teeth at Masima's gelding, and Perrin had to rein him in sharply. "There were darkhounds here in the night," he said, not very smoothly, but it was the best he could manage. "They're gone, and Masuri doesn't think they'll come back, so there's no need to worry." Masima did not smell worried. He never smelled of anything except madness. The sorrel thrust his head aggressively toward Stepper, but Masima pulled him up with a harsh jerk. He rode well, Masima did, but he treated his horses as he did people. For the first time, he looked at Masuri. Perhaps his gaze grew a little hotter, if that was possible. "The shadow can be found everywhere," he said, a heated pronouncement of unquestionable truth. "No one need fear the shadow who follows the Lord Dragon Reborn. May the light illumine his name. Even in death, they will find the final victory of the light." Masuri's mare shied as though burned by that gaze, yet Masuri controlled the animal with a touch on the reins and met Masima's stare with Aes Sedai inscrutability, as calm as a frozen pond. Nothing hinted that she had been meeting this man in secret. "Fear is a useful spur to the wits and to determination when well controlled. If we have no fear of our enemies, that leaves only contempt, and contempt leads to the enemy's victory." You could have thought she was speaking to a simple farmer she had never met before. Anura, watching, looked a little ill. Was she afraid their secret would come out, that their plans for Masima could be spoiled? Masima's lip curled again, in a smile, or a sneer. The Aes Sedai seemed to cease to exist for him as he turned his attention back to Perrin. "Some of those who follow the Lord Dragon have found a town called Sohebor." That was how he always referred to his followers. They really followed the Dragon Reborn, not him. The fact that Masima told them what to do and when and how was just a detail. "A tidy place of 3,000 or 4,000 people, about a day back, or a little less, to the south and west. It seems they were out of the Aiel's path, and their crop was good last year, despite the drought. They have storehouses full of barley, millet, and oats, and other needful things, I should imagine. I know you are running short on fodder, for your men, as well as your horses." "Why would their storehouses be full this time of year?" Berylane leaned forward with a frown, her tone just short of a demand, and not far short of disbelief. Scowling, Nengar put a hand to his saddle sword. No one made demands of the prophet of the Lord Dragon. No one doubted him either. No one who wished to live. Leather creaked as lancers shifted their saddles, but Nengar ignored it. The smell of Masima's madness slithered and flailed in Perrin's nose. Masima studied Berylane. He seemed unaware of Nengar, or the Lancers, or the possibility that men might start killing one another any moment. "A matter of greed," he said finally. "Apparently the grain traders of Sohabor thought to make larger profits by holding their stock until winter drove prices up. But they normally sell west, into Gildan and Amadisia, and events there and in Abu Dar have made them fearful that anything they send out will be confiscated. Their greed has left them with full storehouses."
All right, everyone, I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone stopping by, and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Till next, everyone, y'all stay safe.